Chapter 4266. As soon as Devil's Knight's voice fell, a majestic aura burst out from his body. The explosive aura filled the surrounding void, giving people a heavy feeling of oppression. Qing-Chi felt the pressure on his face, and his face changed in horror. He exclaimed, "Absolutely not!" Nie Tian's proposal of 3 battles was beyond his expectation, and Devil's Knight actually wanted to start the first battle immediately, which surprised him even more. It seemed that Nie Tian had chosen the method that Dongwang Jingrong used to face Hayakuten, but Devil's Knight was a more terrifying opponent than Hayakuten. Judging from the strength that Devil's Knight had shown so far, it was obvious that he was stronger than Nie Tian. If it was under normal circumstances, Nie Tian might have some chance of winning, but at this moment, they were in the 1,000 layers of Ghost Domain, and Devil's Knight could be said to have the geographical advantage. Nie Tian had no chance at all. Nie Tian's face was gloomy, and he didn't speak for a long time. He didn't expect that Devil's Knight would actually start the first battle. The reason why he proposed 3 battles, on one hand, was because he was influenced by Dongwang Jingrong, and on the other hand, it was because he had no other choice. Devil's Knight's killing intent was firm. With his identity as the young Emperor of Ghost Domain, Nie Tian and the others were already in his bag. The agreement of 3 battles was actually a chance to survive. As long as Nie Tian could win the first battle with Devil's Knight's temperament, he definitely wouldn't kill him, but would win in the next 2 battles. However, this first battle, his chance of winning was really not big. Seeing that Nie Tian didn't speak for a long time, Devil's Knight's mouth twitched coldly, and he smiled contemptuously. "Nie Tian, you don't dare?" Without waiting for Nie Tian to speak, Rui Qianyu suddenly stepped forward and said in a deep voice, "He is injured. I will replace him in the first battle." Nie Tian frowned. He could not help but look at Rui Qianyu. The latter's gaze was firm, revealing a cold, murderous intent. Replace? Devil's Knight could not help but chuckle. He glanced at Rui Qianyu coldly and said, "This is a battle between the 2 of us. You're not fit to interfere." "You!" Rui Qianyu's face darkened and her fists cracked. Devil's Knight ignored her. Instead, he looked at Nie Tian and sneered. "Nie Tian, you can't really let a woman stand up for you, right?" Nie Tian smiled faintly and said, "This is a battle between you and me, so of course I won't let anyone else take my place. If you want to fight, I'll be happy to oblige, but I don't mind fighting with you. But let's make this clear. If I win, you can't kill us, and you have to take me to a meeting. Someone." "Sure." Devil's Knight did not question further and agreed immediately. He then smiled darkly and said, "If I win, not only will you die, but the 2 of them will die as well." "Then let's begin," Nie Tian smiled and said calmly. He knew that if he lost, Devil's Knight would not let Qing-Chi and Rui Qianyu leave. Therefore, he must win this battle. "Come on." Devil's Knight smiled coldly and then waved his hand. Suddenly, the runes in the air dissipated and formed a hollow, enclosed space. Like a barrier, it enveloped him and Nie Tian. Qing-Chi was forced back by a powerful force. When she stabilized herself, she could not see Nie Tian and Devil's Knight. All she could see was a huge barrier. "Where is Nie Tian?" Rui Qianyu's eyes trembled and she screamed. Qing-Chi calmed down and said helplessly, "They are inside this barrier. We can only wait." Obviously, Devil's Knight did not want others to see this battle. Previously, when Dongwang Jingrong and Hayakuten fought, there was no one watching. At the same time, inside the barrier. "Nie Tian, this is a sealed barrier. You and I will fight here. It is fair and square." Devil's Knight's eyes flashed with cold light. He said, "As long as you defeat me, the barrier will be automatically removed. But I think you won't be able to see the scene of the barrier being removed." "Cut the crap," Nie Tian replied coldly, but inwardly, he relaxed a little. He thought that Devil's Knight would fight him directly in the 1,000 layers of Ghost domain. That would undoubtedly put more pressure on him. Right now, inside the barrier, it was indeed fair and square. Oomph! Devil's Knight snickered. Then, a black sword appeared in his hand. Instantly, a gloomy atmosphere pervaded the air like an invisible giant hand. Nye Tian felt the pressure. Devil's Knight was much scarier than he had imagined. This was his second time fighting against Devil's Knight, but he felt like it was a lifetime ago. This is my sword, it is called Darkness of Sky. Devil's Knight spoke in a low voice and arrogantly said, "Come and try. Let's see how many swords you can block under Darkness of Sky." Bzzz. As soon as he finished speaking, Darkness of Sky let out a low hum. Then, sword shadows shot out like a waterfall towards Nye Tian. Nye Tian's eyes flickered. He unsheathed the sword in the sky. Boundless sword intent erupted. Sword shadows rushed out like dragons, clashing against Devil's Knight. Bang! In the next moment, there was a muffled sound in the air. The two swords clashed, creating waves of energy that resembled a devouring beast. Nye Tian retreated rapidly. While he was still in midair, blood trickled down the corner of his mouth. On the other hand, Devil's Knight was as still as a bell, as steady as a boulder. The first clash of swords had determined the victor. Nye Tian steadied himself and took a deep breath. Only then did his pale face soften a little. "Nye Tian, is this all you've got?" Devil's Knight snickered arrogantly. "If this is all you've got, then it's too disappointing." Boom! With these words, he slashed his sword down again, carrying a torrential aura that shot directly towards Nye Tian. Nye Tian's reaction was extremely fast. The sword in the sky reversed the momentum and blocked the fatal sword attack. However, he was injured once again. Then, without waiting for Nye Tian to steady himself, an even sharper sword shadow fell like a storm, forcing Nye Tian to retreat continuously. "Nye Tian, you're too weak. You'll definitely die in this battle." Devil's Knight clamored madly. The dark sky left a cold scar in the air, like a mark of death. And with every strike, an additional wound appeared on Nye Tian's body. In the blink of an eye, dozens of strikes had passed. Nye Tian had been forced to the edge of the enchantment. His whole body was dripping with blood. In particular, his wrist was bleeding from the webbing between his thumb and forefinger. His hand was torn, and he could not even hold his sword steadily. He did not expect Devil's Knight to be so terrifying. Fortunately, they were inside the enchantment. If they were in the 1,000 layers Ghost domain, perhaps Nye Tian would not even be able to block a single strike. "What? You can't even hold your sword?" Devil's Knight held his sword horizontally and stared at Nye Tian with a pair of sharp eyes. He laughed coldly. He enjoyed Nye Tian's current predicament, which gave him a hysterical sense of satisfaction. "Devil's Knight, your strength is indeed beyond my expectations. But it won't be that easy for you to kill me." Nye Tian took a step forward and said cold. Then, dark lines appeared on his face. It was the Divine Demon inverse mark. Divine Demon body? Devil's Knight looked at Nye Tian and sneered. "Do you think you're the only one with it?" As soon as he finished speaking, dark lines appeared on his face like a brand. They were even deeper and darker than Nye Tian's Divine Demon inverse mark. Chapter 4267. Nye Tian had activated his Fiend God physique, but he didn't think that Devil's Knight would do the same. Plus, Devil's Knight's Fiend God physique was even more terrifying. "Nye Tian, in my eyes, all of your advantages are nothing but disadvantages." Devil's Knight's lips curled into a cold smile. The inscriptions on his face became even more obvious, making him look extremely evil. "Is that so?" Nye Tian asked coldly, his devil god power surging madly around him like raging waves. Devil's Knight had inherited all his strength, even his Fiend God embryo. His Fiend God strength was even more terrifying. "You will soon find out how big the gap between us is." Devil's Knight sneered and moved. On the dark sword of heaven, black sword intent surged and a gigantic sword shadow appeared, as if it wanted to drown the entire heaven and earth. Nye Tian instantly felt an oppressive pressure. His heart couldn't help but shiver. Mo Ye's strength had far exceeded his expectations. It was simply too terrifying. Accept your death. Right at this moment, Devil's Knight roared. The black sword shadow descended and instantly, the heaven and earth seemed to be collapsing. Waves of energy swept over everything and pressed towards Nye Tian. Nye Tian's eyes flickered. The sword of sky shot out, its sword intent whistled like thunder, accompanied by the roar of a dragon. The heaven and earth shook. Boom! In the next moment, the two terrifying forces collided, shaking the entire space. Violent waves of qi rose to the sky and expanded in all directions. At the same time, outside the enchantment, Qing Qi watched as the enchantment shook. His eyes couldn't help but shiver. The shock in his heart was written all over his face. Nye Tian. Rui Qianyu was also worried. She frowned, her eyes trembled and her palms were sweating. Don't worry, I believe that Nye Tian will win. Qing Qi said in a deep voice. That year, Lord Dong Wangjang Rong won the first battle against Hayakuten very easily. Although Nye Tian's power is slightly weaker than Devil's Knight's, I firmly believe that his strength is comparable to that of Devil's Knight. His temperament is incomparable to that of Devil's Knight. Although he was comforting her, Qing Qi's voice was clearly uncertain. If Nye Tian was only slightly weaker than Devil's Knight, he would still have confidence in Nye Tian, but the problem was that Devil's Knight was obviously much stronger than Nye Tian. With such a great disparity in strength, what were the chances of Nye Tian winning? I believe in him. Rui Qianyu frowned. Suddenly, a strange light flashed in her eyes, and she said in a serious tone. Qing Qi was stunned. He could clearly feel the trust Rui Qianyu had in Nye Tian. Inside the barrier, the great battle was still ongoing. The battle between gods and demons was extremely fierce. Under the situation where both sides had activated their demon-god bodies, the two fought with all their strength. Nye Tian's body was dripping with blood. Only his eyes were still sharp and emitting a strong will to fight. On the other hand, Devil's Knight also suffered some injuries, but obviously not serious. Nye Tian, I feel what you've been through. Devil's Knight stood cold in the air and said coldly, I know that you're best at turning the tables in adversity. But that's when you're facing opponents who don't understand you. I know you very well. It's impossible for you to turn the tables in my hands. As soon as he finished speaking, his figure moved again. A pair of dark wings appeared on his back, making him look like a big bird. The dark sky in his hand fell again, and the tremendous sword will swept everything. Nye Tian's eyes were gloomy, but there was calmness in them. He had experienced countless battles of life and death in his life, but none of them were as cruel and tragic as this. Devil's Knight was too terrifying. He was too strong an opponent. Bang! In an instant, the two fought with all their strength again. After a muffled sound, Nye Tian's figure flew backward like a kite with a broken string. How about it? How many more attacks can you block? Devil's Knight sneered. Suddenly, the barrier was filled with a vast and boundless dark aura, extremely cold. He's too strong. If I want to beat him, I have to do what he doesn't dare to do. Nye Tian steadied himself and calculated in his heart. In the past, when he fought with other martial artists, his biggest advantage was his martial body. Because his martial body far surpassed martial artists of the same level, even those who were a level higher than him could not compare to him. But now, facing Devil's Knight, Nye Tian had no advantage at all. Mo Yi possessed an even stronger fiend god power, a stronger defying the stars power, a stronger dragon vein, and a stronger martial body. This battle is starting to make me feel bored. It's time to end it. At this time, Devil's Knight said in a cold voice. Suddenly, the astral powers in his body burst out, rolling like a tide, as if to devour and crush everything. Nye Tian's face darkened slightly, and there was a touch of ruthlessness in his eyes. Boom! At this moment, Mo's sword slashed down. Under the stimulation of defying the stars, his sword intent was greatly enhanced. The dark sword shadow was like a giant hand from the primordial era, majestic, smashing everything in its path. At the same time, Nietian's figure moved. Unexpectedly, he did not dodge at all, but directly rushed over. At this moment, the astral bloodline in his body erupted, and the bright astral power surged out like a falling galaxy. Roar! In the endless astral light, a giant red dragon appeared. With a roar, it resisted the dark sword shadow head-on, but it could not withstand the huge force and directly shattered. However, it was this split second that gave Nietian a chance to catch his breath. In the next moment, Nietian rushed forward, all kinds of power gushing out of his body like an erupting volcano. Devil's Knight looked at Nietian, his eyes trembling. He obviously hadn't expected the latter to be so crazy. But he wasn't afraid. You want to fight me to the death? Do you think you have a chance? Before he could finish his sentence, a gigantic totem appeared. It was like a screen in the sky, rolling and enveloping the area. Heaven-shrouding totem? Devil's Knight laughed contemptuously. He didn't understand why Nietian was risking his life. Did he want to defeat him with the heaven-shrouding totem? But in the next moment, he felt a sudden pressure, and the smile on his face froze. Just then, an enormous eye appeared above the heaven-shrouding totem, shining with starlight. It was the eye of the starry sky. Next, an enormous crucible descended from the eye of the starry sky, the Hellfire Crucible. Before Devil's Knight could even react, he was already inside the Hellfire Crucible. Meanwhile, outside of the Hellfire Crucible, a sword formation and an enormous enchantment appeared. It was none other than the Starry Sky sword formation and the Starry River airlock. Within the sword formation, a majestic aura flowed. It was none other than the energy of a saint. All of this happened in the blink of an eye, during which Nietian drew upon all of the power in the ninefold Starry River. But right now, he was trembling, his face as white as paper, and his blood energy was surging. Nietian, you think you can trap me with this much power? You're too naive. Devil's Knight roared from within the Hellfire Crucible, unleashing a burst of power that shook the crucible, but failed to break it open. How could this be? Devil's Knight cried. Given how strong Nietian was, how could he possibly trap him? The next moment, he seemed to understand something and shouted again, Blood Chi! He could smell a strong blood energy, and could tell that Nietian was burning his own blood energy to stimulate the heaven-shrouding totem and the Hellfire Crucible. Chapter 4268. 1,000 Layers of Ghost. Outside the enchantment, Qing Chi stared at the enchantment, his archaic eyes trembling. He could actually see a thick blood energy leaking out of the enchantment, causing it to be covered in a faint layer of blood. With such a huge amount of blood and qi leaking out, one could imagine how fierce the battle inside the barrier was. That's Nietian's blood energy, Rui Qianyu said, her eyes trembling. A complex expression could be seen on her face, and it was hard to tell if she was worried or worried about something else. Yeah, Qingqi said, nodding. How could he not sense Nietian's blood energy? He just hadn't said anything about it. Judging from the current situation, Nietian was either seriously injured, or was burning his blood energy to fight. Either way, it was extremely bad for Nietian. Meanwhile, inside the enchantment, the Hellfire Crucible roared, and Devil's Knight was surrounded by hellfire. The flames were like snakes of fire that slammed into him, but couldn't hurt him in the slightest. Even though Nietian was burning his blood energy, he could only temporarily trap Devil's Knight. Idiot! Devil's Knight growled. Although the Hellfire Crucible couldn't kill him, being trapped by Nietian left him feeling incredibly frustrated. He had never imagined that Nietian would be able to fight back in such a dire situation. However, the Hellfire Crucible, Shroud Heaven Totems, Starry Sky Eye, Sage Energy, Starry Sky Sword Formation, and Starry River Airlock were all being used up. Nye Tion's blood energy wouldn't last much longer. Nye Tion's actions were nothing short of a Pyrrhic victory. He was killing 800 enemies, but sacrificing 1,000 of his own. Let's see how much longer you can hold out, Nye Tion. Devil's Knight said, laughing maniacally. As soon as Nye Tion couldn't hold out any longer, he would open the Hellfire Crucible. Good and evil exist together, light and darkness accompany one another. Nye Tion was bathed in blood as he stood there. The blood energy around his body surged like rain as he spoke in a low voice. A wisp of a pale smile appeared on the corners of his mouth as he said, Devil's Knight, since we were born together, then we should die together. Live and die together? When Devil's Knight heard Nye Tion's words, his dark eyes couldn't help but shrink. Then, he suddenly realized something and shouted, Nye Tion, what do you want to do? Even as the words left his mouth, the flames in the Hellfire Crucible exploded with power, transforming into crimson blades that began to devour everything in their path. In the blink of an eye, Devil's Knight sensed that something was amiss. He furrowed his brows, and immediately, the power in his body surged out, but he was unable to withstand the burning power of the hellfire. In the blink of an eye, his entire body was riddled with holes. How is this possible? Moyi cried out as a terrifying burning pain spread throughout his body. Nye Tion's voice rang out in Devil's Knight's ears like a death knell. Devil's Knight, it's true that I'm not as strong as you. But do you have the resolve to live and die together? You madman! Devil's Knight howled. He knew exactly what Nye Tion was trying to do. Nye Tion was burning his own blood energy, and at the same time, draining his bloodline power. He was going to use the Hellfire Crucible to consume him. Of course, the price he had to pay was that Nye Tion would die. This was what Nye Tion meant when he said they would live and die together. You have 10 seconds, Nye Tion said in a deep voice. You can choose to end the battle here. Isn't it just mutual destruction? Bring it on. Moyi, on the other hand, laughed crazily as if he had gone mad. He shouted, I think you have a lot more things to worry about in this world than me. I won't lose out if you accompany me in death. Is that so? Nye Tianling said, smiling. What about your obsession? If you die now, then you'll never be able to defeat me. You'll always be my vassal. You'll always be my shadow. As soon as the words left his mouth, Devil Knight sensed that the flames in the Hellfire Crucible were even more terrifying than before, as though they were about to burn him to death. Outside the barrier, Qing Qi and Rui Qinyu stared at it with bloodshot eyes. Their nerves were stretched taut, and their hearts were in their throats. They didn't even dare to breathe. They knew that the fight inside the barrier was reaching its climax, and that victory would be decided soon. If the person who emerged from the barrier wasn't Nye Tion, then everything would be over. Inside the ward, Nye Tion's flesh aura surged and burned madly like flames. He could clearly feel that his bloodline power was weakening at an alarming rate. The Hellfire Crucible was calm, and not a single sound could be heard. It was as if Devil's Knight had already made up his mind to take Nye Tion down with him. Time passed second by second, and Nye Tion felt as if a lifetime had passed with each passing second. 3, 2, 1. In the last second, Nye Tion steeled his heart, and his 9 dragon meridians roared as they burst into flames. If there was no other way out, then he had to walk the path of death. Stop! In that critical moment, Devil Knight's voice echoed out from the Hellfire Crucible, his voice like thunder, filled with rage and killing intent. In the next instant, the enchantment disappeared. Nye Tion's pupils constricted, and his 9 dragon meridians vanished. His tensed body went limp and he fell to the ground. Rui Qinyu froze for a moment, but then reacted, rushing over to catch Nye Tion. Nye Tion. I didn't lose, Nye Tion said, his mouth twitching. His face was frighteningly pale, and his aura was almost inaudible. don't speak. Rui Qianyu's eyes flickered, and she sent some power into Nie Tian's body. His aura immediately recovered. Qing Qi looked at the nearby Moyi. The latter's face was so gloomy that it seemed like it was dripping with water, and he seemed like a man-eating beast. You didn't win either, Devil's Knight said, his eyes flashing with coldness. Qing Qi frowned. He could guess that Nie Tian had used some sort of extreme method to force Devil's Knight to give up the fight. Nie Tian calmed down a bit and sat down cross-legged. About half an hour later, he was about 30% recovered. Nie Tian rose to his feet and looked at Devil's Knight. Devil's Knight, he said. The first fight isn't over. Once I'm back to full strength, we can continue. Count yourself lucky this time, Devil's Knight said, his expression cold and murderous. Next time you won't be so lucky. Well, I'll wait and see, Nie Tian said with a faint smile. The fight with Devil's Knight just now had been extremely dangerous. Nie Tian had been seriously injured, and his blood vessels had been damaged. However, he had also discovered that Devil's Knight was in the same predicament he had been in before. The power within him was too complex and mixed. Conflict. It was obvious that Devil's Knight's body had not formed the star bloodline, which was why Nie Tian could suppress him with the star bloodline. And it was precisely because the different powers in Devil's Knight's body were stronger than Nie Tian's that it was more difficult to integrate them. Chapter 4269. Let's go, Devil's Knight said cold and gloomy in the 1,000 layers of Ghost Domain. Devil's Knight, I need you to take me to someone, Nie Tian said with a frown. No matter who you want to see, you have to leave this place first, Devil's Knight said coldly, clearly a little impatient. Nie Tian nodded and let out a long breath, calming his expression. Devil's Knight led Nie Tian and the others out of the 1,000 layers of Ghost Domain very quickly. What's that? Nie Tian asked as he walked out of the 1,000 layers of Ghost Domain and saw a huge black vortex floating above. It was like a dark cloud, constantly releasing a dense space-time aura. The entrance to the City of Ghosts, Devil's Knight said indifferently, then he moved and directly charged into the black vortex. His figure disappeared into the vortex in an instant. Nie Tian glanced at Rui Qianyu and Qing Yi, nodded slightly, then followed. The three of them passed through the black vortex and arrived in a whole new world. They were currently standing on a wide street, surrounded by people, bustling with activity. It was actually a bustling market. This is the City of Ghosts? Nie Tian frowned, finding it a little unbelievable. He had imagined the city of 10,000 ghosts to be a relatively dark place, a gloomy place that never saw the light of day. However, it was no different from the large cities of other saints' worlds. It was even busier than regular cities. Follow me, at this moment, Devil's Knight said cold. Nie Tian nodded and immediately followed. Nie Tian, are you all right? Qing Qi followed beside Nie Tian and asked secretly. I'm fine. Nie Tian smiled faintly, indicating that he was fine. Just now, he had burned his blood qi in the barrier and damaged his bloodline. His injuries were extremely severe. Now that he had recovered a little, all he needed to do was to quietly recuperate. Originally, he thought that it would be very difficult to recover from the damage to his bloodline, and there was even a possibility that he might not be able to recover at all. But now, it seemed that he had been too worried. The star bloodline was very different from ordinary bloodlines. It seemed to have the ability to heal itself. Based on how comfortable he was now, it would only take him about half a month to completely recover. Qing Qi's eyes narrowed slightly, and his divine sense swept over Nie Tian's body. After a long time, he nodded. He could tell from Nie Tian's injuries that the latter must have damaged his bloodline by burning his blood qi. Usually, such injuries were irreversible and almost impossible to recover from. However, Nie Tian's martial body was different from ordinary people. Not only did he recovered very quickly, which greatly exceeded Qing Qi's expectations. The three of them followed behind Devil's Knight and soon entered a narrow alley. Nie Tian could clearly perceive that there was a strong aura surging in the surrounding space. Obviously, this was not an ordinary alley. This guy brought us here. He won't do us harm, right? Qing Chi became vigilant and secretly transmitted his voice to Nie Tian. I don't think so. Nie Tian was very calm. If Devil's Knight wanted to kill them, he would have done it long ago. There was no need to go through so much trouble. Soon, they passed through the alley and a secluded small courtyard appeared in front of them, elegant and unique. Devil's Knight entered the small courtyard with Nie Tian and others. An old black-robed figure came out. Seeing Devil's Knight, he bowed his head very respectfully and said respectfully, "Young Master D, you're back." As for Nie Tian and the others behind Devil's Knight, the old man acted as if he didn't see them and completely ignored them. Devil's Knight slightly nodded, then looked at Nie Tian and said, "Nie Tian, if you want to see someone, just tell Elder Shur." Then, he directly turned into the backyard. Nie Tian frowned. Just as he wanted to open his mouth to stop Devil's Knight, the Elder Shur beat him to it. The latter's face was cold and solemn as he said, "Young Master D is tired. If you have something to say, tell it to I." Nie Tian was a bit helpless and could only nod. He could see that the person called Elder Shur was very respectful towards Devil's Knight. He seemed to be an old servant. "Elder Shur, this junior is Nie Tian." Nie Tian looked at Elder Shur, faintly smiled and said, "I want to ask Elder Shur for a favor. Take us to see someone." "Who?" Elder Shur's face was indifferent, looking very impatient. "The 10,000 ghost ancestor," Nie Tian said with a faint smile. "You can't see this person, find someone else." Elder Shur's eyes trembled slightly as he said coldly, "Why?" Nie Tian frowned and asked. "There is no why." Elder Shur was very impolite and said coldly, "What if I insist?" Nie Tian's face sank. He suddenly couldn't restrain himself and said coldly, "Then find someone else." Elder Shur's mouth twitched as he laughed. "HM?" Nie Tian frowned, his face very ugly, and said, "Elder Shur, taking us to see the 10,000 ghost ancestor is what Devil's Knight promised me. You don't want your young Master D to go back on his word, right? Gui Zhu has already passed away. How can you see him?" Elder Shur hesitated for a moment before asking, "Dead?" Nie Tian's eyes trembled as he said in shock, "Impossible. During the Hidden Dragon battle, he had just fought with the 10,000 ghost ancestor. How could the latter die so easily?" "You don't believe in I?" Elder Shur's face was gloomy and seemed to be on the verge of losing his temper. "You." Nie Tian was also a little angry. His fists slightly clenched, but he couldn't speak for a while. "What about me?" Elder Shur sneered, his face full of provocation. At this time, Qing Chi, who was standing off to the side, smiled faintly and walked up. He bowed deeply to the martial elder and said, "Senior Evil Monarch, please calm down. Nie Tian is young and ignorant. Please forgive him if he has offended you." "You know I?" Elder Shur looked at Qing Chi, and his aged eyes suddenly shrank. He actually released a chilling evil aura as he coldly asked, "When Junior was young, I had the honor to witness the battle between Senior Evil Commander and Sir Dong Wang Jing Rong." Qing Chi smiled faintly and said respectfully, Elder Shur frowned as if he remembered something. He laughed and said, "So you are the little boy who stayed by Dong Wang Jing Rong's side. I didn't think you have grown up so much. It has been so many years, but Senior Evil Commander still remembers Junior. It is my honor." Qing Chi smiled and slightly bowed. There was no trace of pretense. It was obvious that he was very respectful towards the person before him. Seeing this, Nie Tian couldn't help but be surprised. He didn't think that this ordinary-looking elder would have such a high status. Even Qing Chi was so respectful towards him. Plus, this elder had fought against Dong Wang Jing Rong, so he must be very powerful. "Since you are the descendant of an old friend, There is no need to be so reserved. Elder Shi looked at Qing Qi and his expression softened a lot. He said, after the fall of Dongwang Jingrong, you juniors must have had a hard time. What do you want? Just say it. Yes. Qing Qi nodded and said, actually, Junior wants to see the 10,000 ghost ancestor because I want to ask him some things. Since Senior Evil Commander is here, asking him will be the same. Haha. Evil Commander laughed twice, stroked his white beard, and said, in terms of age, this senior is older than Guizhu. Whatever Guizhu knows, this senior must also know. Ask away. Chapter 4270. After Qing Qi mentioned amorous affair, Elder Shizhen was shocked and stood rooted to the ground for a long time. With Elder Shizhen's temperament, he should have seen through everything. Why was he acting so strangely now? Looks like he knows about amorous affair, Nie Tian said in his heart as his eyes darkened. Senior Evil Dominator, if you know about amorous affair, please tell us. After a while, Qing Qi waited for Elder Shizhen to calm down before he said respectfully. Elder Shizhen took a deep breath and his aged face softened. However, his eyes were still flickering as if he was nervous. He asked, why are you looking for amorous affair? This. Qing Qi's face stiffened and he was in a difficult position. The matter regarding Rui Qianyu was a taboo and it was not convenient to tell outsiders. If you don't tell me the truth, I will not tell you about amorous affair, Elder Shizhen frowned and said cold. Qing Qi's face darkened and he could not help but look at Nie Tian. He had no right to decide whether to tell Elder Shizhen the truth or not. He still needed Nie Tian's approval. Senior Evil Dominator, it's about the Emperor's palace. Nie Tian thought for a while, and took a step forward to explain what had happened. However, he did not mention Rui Qianyu's 10 annihilation of the evil woman. The Emperor's palace wants to kill her? Elder Shizhen's eyes darkened after hearing Nie Tian's words. He looked at Rui Qianyu and said cold, then I wants to know what kind of power she has in her body to make the Emperor's palace so afraid. Nie Tian's expression changed slightly. He was about to speak but Rui Qianyu beat him to it. She said directly, 10 annihilation of the evil woman. Elder Shizhen's reaction was even more intense than before. His aged eyes suddenly narrowed as if he was struck by lightning. His entire body trembled involuntarily and then froze on the spot as if he had been petrified. Seeing Elder Shizhen's reaction, Nie Tian and Qing Qi could not help but look at each other. They did not expect Elder Shizhen to know about 10 annihilation of the evil woman. From the looks of it, he was very familiar with it. Why were you really awakened the 10 annihilation evil woman? After a long time, Elder Shi finally reacted, but when he looked at Rui Qianyu, his eyes were filled with excitement and fear, and his voice was trembling. Rui Qianyu was very calm and nodded slightly. Heavens, after so many years, is the 10 annihilations really going to have a female empress? Elder Shi stared at Rui Qianyu for a long time, as if he was trying to confirm something. Then, he looked up to the sky and let out a long cry. Huh! When Nie Tian heard the empress from the elder's mouth, his eyes couldn't help but tremble in astonishment. The mysterious old man, Yu Jing, who had suddenly appeared, vowed to protect Rui Qianyu with his life, and he addressed Rui Qianyu as the empress. It was Yu Jing who told them to find amorous affair. And at this moment, the elder also mentioned the empress. How could he not be shocked? What do you mean by the empress? Rui Qianyu's beautiful eyes darkened, and she asked in a serious tone. Elder Shi's face was full of surprise and shock, and it took him a long time to recover, but he didn't answer Rui Qianyu. Instead, he said, Your Majesty, please release the 10 annihilations evil woman. I want to witness it with my own eyes. Rui Qianyu frowned and hesitated for a while, but she still released the 10 annihilations evil woman bloodline. An extremely evil aura enveloped her body, giving people a chilling sense of oppression. The 10 annihilations evil woman, It really is the 10 Annihilations evil woman. Elder Shur was shocked and he almost cheered, but he couldn't help but look a little funny. Rui Qianyu's brows were tightly knitted, and she looked a little helpless. Nie Tian and Qing Qi were also speechless, and they could only watch quietly from the side. Your servant, Shur Yu Hua, greets your majesty. At this moment, Elder Shur made another shocking move, and he directly knelt in front of Rui Qianyu, and kowtowed deeply. Senior, what are you doing? The sudden action caught Rui Qianyu off guard, and she immediately went forward to help him up. Perhaps Elder Shur was too excited. He stood up shakily, and looked at Rui Qianyu with a face full of reverence, and said, "The 10 Annihilations evil woman finally has an empress." Senior, the empress you speak of, what does it mean? Rui Qianyu suppressed the shock in her heart, and asked in a low voice. Your Majesty, don't be in a hurry, let me explain slowly. Elder Shur smiled faintly and said, but before that, I need to call young Master D out, and let you two reunite. As he spoke, Elder Shur turned around and walked into the inner courtyard. Reunite? Rui Qianyu was confused, and she had no idea what was going on. She was no stranger to Devil's Night, and she also knew about Devil's Night's background. What did Elder Shur mean by reuniting with him? Nie Tian and Qing Qi were also confused, and could only wait for Elder Shur to return. After a while, Elder Shur came out from the inner courtyard with Devil's Night. Young Master D, come and greet the Empress, Elder Shur said excitedly, and walked quickly to Rui Qianyu's side with a smile. Devil's Knight's face was gloomy, and his brows were deeply furrowed, obviously unwilling. Young Master D, this is the Empress, your mother. What are you still standing there for? Seeing that Devil's Knight did not move, Elder Shur's attitude suddenly changed. He was no longer respectful and even a little angry. Mother! When Rui Qianyu heard this form of address, her pretty face suddenly changed, and the corner of her mouth twitched a few times. Nie Tian and Qing Qi were even more puzzled. According to Elder Shur, Rui Qianyu seemed to be Devil's Knight's mother. But Nie Tian was very clear about Devil's Knight's background, and it had nothing to do with Rui Qianyu. Your Majesty, although you are not young Master D's biological mother, in the future, you will grant him a new life, so you are his mother. Elder Shur looked at Rui Qianyu, bowed and said. Rui Qianyu frowned, and she did not understand. Your Majesty, you will understand what this old servant is saying in the future. Elder Shur smiled faintly, then looked at Devil's Knight coldly, and said in a deep voice, Young Master D, are you still not going to bow? Devil's Knight greets the Empress. Devil's Knight's face was very ugly, but he still bowed slightly. How dare you? However, Elder Shur suddenly roared, Young Master D, Her Majesty is your mother, you have to kneel and pay respect to her. Devil's Knight suddenly raised his head, and a pair of blood-red eyes, like a ferocious beast. What? Are you going to disobey the Empress? Seeing him like this, Elder Shur was even more furious and growled cold. At this time, Rui Qianyu spoke, and at this time, she said faintly, Elder Shur, don't be so formal. Let him go first. Elder Shur frowned, and before he could say anything, Devil's Knight directly turned around and went into the inner courtyard. Outrageous! Elder Shur looked at Devil's Knight's back and said fiercely, It's okay. Rui Qianyu, however, waved her hand and smiled faintly, Elder Shur, I want to know what is going on. Your Majesty, aren't you looking for amorous affair? Elder Shur's face softened, and he smiled faintly and said, This old servant is the person you are looking for. You! Rui Qianyu's beautiful eyes darkened, and she was momentarily stunned. Could it be that Elder Shur was amorous affair? Chapter 4271. In the small courtyard, Nie Tian and the others stared at the Grand Elder in astonishment. It took them a few seconds to react. How could they have imagined that the dying old man in front of them was the romantic flower Snow Moon that Yu Jing had mentioned? Seeing the reactions of Nie Tian and the others, Elder Shur could only smile helplessly. After a moment, Nye Tian finally calmed down and took a deep breath before asking, Grand Elder, you said that you're the moon in Windflower, Snow Moon. Does that mean that there are 3 other people in Windflower, Snow Moon? Yes. The elder nodded and sighed. Feng Hua Shui Yu's true identity is the 4 great evils of the Ghost Clan. The 4 great evil lords. Qing Qi's eyes trembled. He seemed very shocked. Of course, Elder sure knew what Qing Qi was thinking. He faintly smiled and said, You didn't expect it, did you? The 4 great evil sovereigns actually exist. Qing Qi nodded heavily and said, Junior once learned from Eastern Emperor that in addition to the ghost race and the Lord of 10,000 Ghosts, the ghost race also has the 4 great evil seniors. However, at that time, Lord Dongwang had also questioned the existence of the 4 evil lords. Since he hasn't seen the 4 great evil sovereigns with his own eyes, he suspects that the 4 great evil sovereigns are just a rumor spread by the ghost race to intimidate other races. Elder Sure chuckled and said, Back then, it was I who revealed the existence of the 4 great evil exalts to Dongwang Jingrong. Moreover, he told him that I was only one of the 4 great evil exalts, and he was the weakest amongst them. Who would have thought that this old bastard would, however, I doubt I's words. Qing Qi let out a hollow laugh and said nothing. Since Elder had fought against Dongwang Jingrong before, it meant that both of them were at the same level. Even if there was a difference in strength, there shouldn't be much of a difference. Elder Sure was already terrifying enough in the ghost race, but there were still 3 existences that were as famous as Elder Sure or even stronger than him. How could Dongwang Jingrong not be suspicious? Very few people in the world know about the 4 great evil lords, and even fewer know about Amorous Affair. Elder Sure smiled and continued, Since that Yu Jing knows about Amorous Affair, he must be one of the higher-ups of the 10 Annihilations clan. Grand Elder, what's going on with the Empress? Rui Qianyu calmed down and asked in a deep voice. Elder Sure faintly smiled and let out a long sigh. He seemed to have recalled many things and said, Before the primordial era, the ghost race was divided into 4 branches. The 10 Annihilation branch, the Underworld branch, the Desolate Flow branch, and the Abyss branch. Right now, the 1,000 Layers Ghost Domain and the City of 10,000 Ghosts are basically all ghosts of the Desolate Stream lineage. As for the 10 Annihilations lineage, they lived in the 10 Annihilations heavenly prison that very few people knew about. The Abyss lineage resides in the eternal abyss that never sees the light of day. At this point, the elder involuntarily paused. What about the Nether bloodline? Nye Tian frowned and couldn't help but ask. The Nether race went extinct a long time ago. There are no longer any Abyss devils in the Saints' world. Elder Sure sighed. His expression was rather strange. There had to be a story behind this. However, Nye Tian's eyes slightly darkened as he thought of something. Jun Aoqing's real name was Flawless Yuming, the princess of the Yuming family. Could she be from the extinct Abyss devils? However, he was only guessing and didn't ask Elder Sure. What does this have to do with the Empress? Rui Qianyu was a little anxious and couldn't help but ask. Of course it's related. Elder Sure faintly smiled and gestured for Rui Qianyu not to be too anxious. He said, Among the 4 branches of the ghost race, the 10 Annihilation branch is the strongest. Throughout history, the Lord of all Ghosts basically came from the 10 Annihilation branch, but in the primordial era, because the 10 Annihilation branch was too powerful, it incurred the calamity of extinction. At that time, the 10 Annihilation branch suffered the most tragic massacre. Of the entire clan, not even 1 in 10,000 survived. Those who were lucky enough to survive eventually distanced themselves from the heavenly sacred world. They hid in the 10 Annihilation Heaven prison. However, the people of the 10 Annihilation clan did not forget the hatred of extinction. They have always been waiting for the opportunity for revenge, for the legendary 10 Annihilation evil woman to come. Nye Tian's expression became slightly solemn. Although Elder Sure's explanation was simple, he could imagine the bloodshed at that time. He faintly felt that the disaster of the 10 Annihilation clan was very likely related to the human sovereign palace. It could even be the plan of the human sovereign palace. At this time, Elder Shur glanced at Rui Qianyu and said, "The people of the 10 Annihilation clan must have sensed the awakening of the 10 Annihilation evil woman, so they sent Yu Jing out to find the Empress. So that's how it is." Rui Qianyu nodded slightly and then asked in confusion, "Then why did Elder Yu ask us to find Romance before he died?" Romance is the 4 great evil lords of the ghost race. The reason why the ghost race created the 4 great evil lords was to protect the most important person of the ghost race, the 10 Annihilation Empress. Elder Shur nodded and said, "The 10 Annihilation branch has always been regarded as the royal branch of the ghost race. When the 10 Annihilation branch was destroyed, the other 3 branches of the ghost race were also massacred. Not only was the 10 Annihilation branch waiting for the Empress to come, but the entire ghost race is waiting." As he spoke, Elder Shur was a little excited, his eyes surging with a fiery light. "Waiting?" Suddenly, Rui Qianyu laughed and said, "Waiting for the Empress to avenge you." "Yes." Elder Shur nodded heavily and said, "We have never forgotten the hatred of the 10 Annihilation." However, Rui Qianyu frowned slightly, as if in deep thought, and said, "What if I don't want to avenge?" Elder Shur was stunned and did not know what to do. In his opinion, the Empress was the leader of the ghost race. She should avenge her people, she must avenge her people. "If I were really your Empress, I would protect my people, but the hatred of the past has nothing to do with me." Rui Qianyu spoke again, cold. Elder Shur was stunned and could not speak for a long time. He did not think that Rui Qianyu would have such a thought. However, he was not in a hurry because Rui Qianyu had just returned to the ghost race. When she truly understood the ghost race, she would change her mind. "Your Majesty, since you have returned to the ghost race, this old servant will inform the Ghost Lord and announce the Empress's arrival to the entire ghost race." Elder Shur quickly calmed down and said excitedly, "No need." But Rui Qianyu immediately waved her hand and said, "The news that I am the Empress cannot be leaked. It is fine as long as the 4 evil lords know." Elder Shur was stunned for a moment. He thought that Raindrop Qianya was worried and immediately said, "Your Majesty, don't worry. Although the human Emperor's palace is powerful, they wouldn't dare to touch the city of 10,000 ghosts easily. Even if they do come, this old servant and the others will not let them. They will not harm Her Majesty." Rui Qianyu frowned, her expression cold, and said, "I said, it is fine as long as the 4 of you know this." Elder Shur was stunned again, hesitated, but still nodded in agreement. Chapter 4272. Elder Shur agreed readily, but his expression was hesitant, which made Nie Tian and the others tense up. "Is there a problem?" Rui Qianyu's beautiful eyes darkened as she asked. Looking at Elder Shur's expression, it seemed that the other 3 evil masters would not be easy to meet. "Your Majesty, to tell you the truth, the 3 old men are a bit strange, and they have been in retreat for many years. If you want to meet them, I'm afraid it will be troublesome." Elder Shur's expression was a bit awkward as he said hesitantly, "Grand Elder, could it be that they would dare not to meet the Empress?" Nie Tian frowned and asked with a smile. From Elder Shur's behavior, the Empress's position in the ghost race should be supreme, even higher than the Ghost Lord and Guizhu. Otherwise, Elder Shur would not kneel. If that was the case, it should be easy for the Empress to meet anyone. "Little friend Nie Tian, you don't know, but the 3 old men have bad tempers. They usually don't show up. Even I don't have many opportunities to meet them." Elder Shur knew what Nie Tian was thinking and sighed, "Your Majesty. Although I am very noble, the 3 old men will not easily admit it." Nie Tian frowned again and thought, "They won't easily admit it, so why did you kneel?" However, this was just what he thought, so he naturally could not say it out loud. Instead, he said, "Then how can we meet them?" "Actually, it's not difficult to meet them, as long as we can pass the test they set up. Elder Shur looked at Nyetian, and his old eyes suddenly shot out a sharp light as he asked, "If I am not mistaken, little friend Nyetian should be a genius. A sword master." "You can say so." Nyetian's eyes narrowed, and he had a bad feeling in his heart, but he nodded lightly. "Little friend Nyetian, you are now in the 9th heavenly layer of Saint, right?" Elder Shur nodded with a smile and continued to ask. Nyetian nodded. "Saint Realm Sword Tao, Sword Rhythm, Divine Decree, Sacred Meaning, Sword Heavenly Calamity, Sword Sense Against God, Sword Martial Saint." Elder Shur stared at Nyetian and couldn't help but smile. Stroking his white beard, he said, "My young friend Nyetian is so young, yet you have already reached the 9th sky of holy sense. It is indeed a good sword material. Elder, if you have something to say, just say it." Nyetian couldn't help but feel a bit impatient when he saw the elder's expression. "My young friend Nyetian, one of us venerables also excels in the way of the sword." The test he had set before he went into seclusion was a sword formation. Before he went into seclusion, he said that as long as someone could break through the sword formation, he would be willing to become sworn brothers with that person. He stared at Nyetian with a burning gaze and said with a smile, "Sworn brothers?" Nyetian couldn't help but smile. This method was a little strange. Many experts would set up some tests, but generally speaking, those who passed the tests would be accepted as disciples. It was rare to see someone like this person who swore an oath of brotherhood with a disciple. "My young friend Nyetian, the person I is talking about is the head of the 4 venerables, In Feng Wuwa." Elder Shur smiled again, as if he was a bit proud. He created countless legends in the sword world. Selfless sword master. Hearing the name In Feng Wuwa, Qing Chi's pupils shrank and he was shocked on the spot. Nyetian's heart shuddered at Qing Chi's reaction. It seemed that this In Feng Wuwa had quite a background. "Have you also heard of his famous name?" The elder couldn't help but look at Qing Chi with a smile. "Yes." Qing Chi calmed down and nodded. "I have heard of this person from a senior in the sword world, but I didn't think that senior selfless sword master would be the head of the 4 venerables." "Ha!" Elder Shur smiled and said, "There are very few people in the world who know about the 4 venerables, so there is nothing strange about it. Senior venerables, I heard that senior selfless sword master was as famous as the Yang God Sword Emperor. Is that true?" Qing Chi nodded and asked carefully, "Yang God Sword Emperor?" Hearing this name, Nyetian's heart suddenly trembled, and his expression changed. He never thought that selfless sword master would be as famous as the Yang God Sword Emperor. He had seen the Yang God Sword Emperor's strength with his own eyes. He was truly a person who could defy the heavens with his sword. However, Mori Shire once said that the Yang God Sword Emperor was the only person who had truly achieved the unity of man and sword. Moreover, the Yang God Sword Emperor used a broken sword to defeat all the experts in the heavens and reach the peak of the heavens. Would there be anyone else who could be as famous as him? Hearing Qing Chi's words, Elder Shur shook his head and said with a bitter smile, "At that time, before the Yang God reached the unity of man and sword, he was already an invincible existence in the heavens. At that time, the only one who could compete with the Yang God in sword principle was In Feng Wuwa. Only In Feng Wuwa. One of them was called the Yang God Sword Emperor, and the other was called the Selfless Sword Master, so they were called one emperor and one demon by the sword world at that time. Unfortunately, the Yang God reached the unity of man and sword with the help of the natural sword embryo. After that, In Feng Wuwa was no longer a match for the Yang God." When Elder Shur said this, he seemed to feel some regret and helplessness. "So that's how it is." Qing Chi nodded and said, "However, for a period of time, I am afraid that only senior selfless sword master could be as famous as the Yang God Sword Emperor." "Ha ha!" Elder Shur looked at Qing Chi and couldn't help but laugh. In fact, after the Yang God reached the unity of man and sword, he also fought with Yin Feng Wua several times. Although Yin Feng Wua was not born with a natural sword embryo, his understanding of sword principle has reached a level that ordinary people can't reach. Therefore, when Yin Feng Wua fought with the Yang God, he gradually understood the mystery of the unity of man and sword. After that, he went into seclusion for hundreds of thousands of years. Finally, when he came out, he reached the unity of man and sword. This. Nie Tian and Qing Qi were shocked at the same time and were stunned on the spot. Everyone thought that the Yang God Sword Emperor was the only swordsman to reach the unity of man and sword. They didn't expect that the selfless sword master had also reached this level. What was even more terrifying was that the selfless sword master had reached this level without the natural sword embryo. This understanding of sword principle could be said to be shocking. Although the selfless sword master had borrowed the power of the Yang God Sword Emperor, his understanding of sword principle was absolutely unprecedented. Senior Evil Master, did the selfless sword master fight with the Yang God Sword Emperor later? Qing Qi immediately reacted and was extremely excited, asking with a trembling voice. Elder Shi smiled again and said helplessly, when Yin Feng Wua came out of seclusion, the Yang God had already disappeared. Sigh. Qing Qi couldn't help but let out a long sigh and said, "It's a pity that the two swordsmen who reached the unity of man and sword had no chance to fight." Yes. Elder Shi nodded with a smile, but his expression was very bitter, as if he was complaining for Yin Feng Wua. Senior, why didn't Senior Yin Feng Wua fight with other swordsmen to prove himself? At this time, Nie Tian couldn't help but ask. Logically speaking, with the disappearance of the Yang God Sword Emperor, wasn't this the time for Yin Feng Wua to make a name for himself? Invincible in the holy world, it could be said that all the mountains were small. Yin Feng Wua is not a person who seeks fame. Moreover, at that level, he has no interest in fighting with other swordsmen, Elder Shi said with a smile. Nie Tian smiled awkwardly and nodded slightly. Chapter 4273. Nie Tian was startled awake, and his heart couldn't help but sink. It seemed that Elder Shi wanted him to break the sword formation that Yin Feng Wua had left behind. Yes. The Grand Elder nodded solemnly. He looked at Nie Tian with a burning gaze, as if he was observing the latter's reaction. Before Nie Tian could say anything, Qing Qi, who was standing to the side, exclaimed, "This isn't appropriate, right?" His face became somewhat unsightly. Yin Feng Wua was once on par with the Yang God Sword Emperor. The strength of the sword formation that he had left behind was imaginable. Although Nie Tian was talented in swordsmanship, Qing Qi did not believe that the former could catch up to Yin Feng Wua. After all, Yin Feng Wua had said that anyone who could break his sword formation would be willing to become sworn brothers with him. From this, it could be seen that the sword formation that Yin Feng Wua had left behind must be very difficult. Otherwise, how could he allow the person to break the formation to become sworn brothers with him? Elder Shi wanted Nie Tian to break the sword formation that Yin Feng Wua had left behind. This was clearly putting Nie Tian in great danger. Elder Shi glanced at Qing Qi and said with a faint smile, "The sword formation that Yin Feng Wua had left behind is indeed very dangerous. However, because it was left behind by Yin Feng Wua, the sword essence and rhythm that it contains are absolutely what any swordsman dreams of." As he spoke, the corner of his mouth raised slightly. He looked at Nie Tian and said, "I think this is very beneficial to you." Nie Tian nodded, but didn't say anything. How could he not understand what Elder Shi meant? The sword formation that Yin Feng Wua had left behind contained his own sword essence. The sword principle contained in the sword essence of this legend, that was once on par with the Yang God Sword Emperor, was something that no swordsman could resist. It could not be resisted. Swordsmanship needed to be comprehended, but if there was an expert to guide, it would undoubtedly be twice the result with half the effort. Just like Yin Feng Wua, if he had not fought with the Yang God Sword Emperor, he would probably never be able to step into the realm of swordsmanship. If a swordsman could comprehend something from Yin Feng Wu's sword formation, it would undoubtedly be a subversive help to his path of swordsmanship. Such a temptation was indeed difficult for any swordsman to resist. However, it was precisely because of this that it undoubtedly showed that boundless killing intent was hidden within the sword formation. Otherwise, all the swordsmen would definitely swarm outside the sword formation, waiting for an opportunity to enter. Grand Elder had long seen that Qing Chi's attitude towards Nie Tian was very respectful, and he was constantly protecting Nie Tian, so he used the sword array to lure Nie Tian. Senior Evil Master, the sword formation left by Senior Yin Feng Wu is not that simple, is it? Qing Chi asked directly, having seen through the elder's hidden meaning. Little friend Nie Tian, if you are interested, I can take you to see the sword formation right away. Elder Shi nodded and looked at Nie Tian. All right. Nie Tian smiled faintly and nodded happily. Qing Chi frowned and wanted to say something, but was stopped by Nie Tian with a wave of his hand. He was very worried that after seeing the sword formation, Nie Tian would not be able to resist the temptation. Then, Elder Shi was about to let Devil's Knight come out to say goodbye to Rui Qianyu, but was stopped by the latter. Elder Shi thought for a moment and did not insist. He immediately brought Nie Tian and the others to the sword formation. Under Elder Shi's lead, everyone left the city of 10,000 ghosts and set off for the Fengyu Mountains where the sword formation was located. About half a day later, Nie Tian and the others arrived at the demonic peak of the Fengyu Mountains. The cliffs are extremely high, and the peak is like a long sword. What a magnificent peak! Qing Chi looked at the peak in front of him, and could not help but exclaim. Nie Tian's gaze fell on the peak of the mountain, and he could not help but nod his head. The demonic peak was nearly 1,000,000 meters high. It was shaped like a sharp sword, piercing into the boundless sky, and it was daunting. This is the demonic peak. The sword formation left by Yin Feng Wu is at the peak. Elder Shi smiled faintly, and then his figure moved. Like a white light, he flew straight towards the demonic peak. Seeing this, Nie Tian and the others immediately followed. In the blink of an eye, they arrived at the periphery of the demonic peak. Suddenly, they felt the powerful sword intent in the surrounding space, and their expressions changed. This old thing's sword intent is indeed terrifying. At this moment, even Elder Shi's face could not help but darken slightly. Qing Chi's expression was shocked and embarrassed, and he could not help but look at Nie Tian. The latter was stunned for a long time before he finally let out a sigh of relief and said, "This level of sword intent can only be compared to the Yang God Sword Emperor." That day, when the Yang God Sword Emperor appeared, it gave Nie Tian a great shock, and gave him a new understanding of the sword Tao. And now, when he felt the level of sword intent of the unity of man and sword, his heart was also shaken. This kind of sword intent was as vast as the heaven and earth, as continuous as the sea, vast and endless. The majesty of the sword intent had the momentum to envelop the heaven and earth. After a moment, Nie Tian calmed down slightly. He could feel that the Yin Feng selflessness and the Yang God Sword Emperor's sword intent were on the same level, but the concept was different. The Yang God Sword Emperor's sword intent was even more extreme, even more vigorous, giving off a feeling of bravery and light. On the other hand, the Yin Feng selflessness sword intent was even more tyrannical, even sharper, as if it contained the power to destroy heaven and earth. Nie Tian, the sword formation is on the sword discourse arena at the peak of the mountain. Do you dare to charge in? At this time, Elder Shi spoke and asked with a faint smile. Nie Tian's gaze darkened as he locked onto the sword discourse arena at the peak of the mountain. He saw a small sword formation standing majestically, and the sword intent in the surrounding space was released from the sword formation. Nie Tian, this sword formation isn't something to be trifled with. You'd better think twice. Qing Chi was afraid that Nie Tian would agree without hesitation. Nie Tian smiled and nodded. He then looked at Elder Shi and asked, "Senior, may I ask if this sword array has a name?" "Of course." Elder Shi laughed and said, "This sword array is called the Seven Wounds Sword Array. Yin Feng Wua cultivates the Seven Wounds sword technique, and his killing intent is extremely strong. The Seven Wounds sword formation is derived from the Seven Wounds sword technique. Seven Wounding sword formation." Nie Tian's eyes narrowed as he sensed an extremely strong killing intent. Elder Shi suddenly let out a strange laugh and said, "When Yin Feng Wua first went into seclusion, many swordsmen tried to challenge the Seven Injuries sword formation. Among them, there were some genius swordsmen, and even many famous swordsman masters. Unfortunately, not a single person. They succeeded, and their fates were extremely miserable." "Miserable?" Nie Tian's eyes trembled slightly, showing a peculiar interest. "Yes." Elder Shi nodded with a smile and said, "Half of the swordsmen who entered the Seven Wounds sword formation died instantly. As for the other half, although they were lucky enough to escape from the sword formation, they were either crippled or crippled. Many of them even lost their minds. Madmen." This. Hearing what Elder Shi said, Qing Chi couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. Nie Tian didn't have much of a reaction. With a calm face, he waited for Elder Shi to continue. Elder Shi once again looked at Nie Tian and smiled, saying, "Yin Feng Wua's Seven Wounds sword intent is extremely overbearing. One sword, 7 wounds, penetrating into the bone and marrow. Back then, even the Yang God Sword Emperor was injured by the 7 Wounds sword intent. The 7 Wounds sword formation perfectly inherited the overbearing 7 Wounds sword intent." Chapter 4274. Nie Tian smiled confidently as he looked at the 7 Wounding sword formation. "Nie Tian, don't be rash," Qing Chi exclaimed after he regained his senses. Elder Shi, on the other hand, smiled meaningfully without saying a word. Everything was within his expectations. He could tell that Nie Tian would definitely attempt the 7 Wounding sword formation. "Nie Tian, I don't have to meet this person. You have to think it through," said Rui Qinyu softly, as she also knew how dangerous the 7 Wounding sword formation was. She was not trying to dissuade Nie Tian. She would support whatever decision he made, but she did not want him to take the risk because of her. "I've thought it through." Nie Tian smiled faintly, his eyes brimming with confidence. Nie Tian had considered many things before he decided to attempt the 7 Wounding sword formation. Yin Feng Wua was the leader of romance. As long as he could let Rui Qinyu meet him, Rui Qinyu would be very safe. Yin Feng Wua was a swordsman who was on par with the Yang God Sword Emperor. One could imagine how powerful he was. Even the Heaven Dao Pavilion Master might not be a match for Yin Feng Wua. In that case, if the Human Emperor Palace really wanted to pursue Rui Qinyu, they would have to send out even more powerful figures from the Human Emperor Palace. In fact, Nie Tian felt that even the current Human Emperor might not be a match for Yin Feng Wua. Therefore, if he could hire such a protector for Rui Qinyu, she would naturally not be afraid of the Human Emperor Palace. On the other hand, Nie Tian was thinking about himself. The 7 Wounding sword formation was indeed dangerous, but it also contained great opportunities. This was a fatal temptation to any swordsman. More importantly, he had 3 fights with Devil's Knight. Therefore, he needed to improve his abilities as soon as possible. Although there was no clear winner in the previous fight, he knew that Devil's Knight had an overwhelming advantage over him. Therefore, for the sake of the next battle, he had to take the risk. Seeing that Nie Tian had already made up his mind, Qing Chi's expression became unsightly and he was momentarily speechless. For a person like Nie Tian, once he made a decision, he wouldn't change his mind easily. He had to break through this sword formation no matter what. Rui Qinyu didn't have much of a reaction, she just nodded slightly. Little friend Nyetian, the 7 wounds sword formation is different from ordinary sword formations. Any swordsman who enters the sword formation will be able to summon a power that is related to the swordsman's realm. At this time, Elder Shur looked at Nyetian and said, "Your cultivation is only at the first level of the heaven tribulation, and your sword Tao realm is only at the second level. It's the 9 heavens of heavenly justice. This is a huge advantage for you." Nyetian smiled faintly. Of course, he understood the elder's meaning. The 7 wounding sword formation was left by the selfless sword demon, intended to test the swordsman's talent in swordsmanship, not to test the swordsman's strength. If it was a simple test of strength, perhaps no one would be able to break through Yinfeng's selfless sword formation. Nyetian's strength and realm were both very weak, so the power that he could summon from the sword formation was relatively weak. On the other hand, his martial body was strong, so this became his advantage. "Please." Elder Shur smiled faintly, then flashed to the side. He really wanted to see how long Nyetian could last in the 7 wounds sword formation. Of course, he didn't believe that Nyetian could break through the 7 wounds sword formation. In his opinion, no one in this world could break through the 7 wounds sword formation, because he didn't believe that there could be a swordsman as terrifying as Yin Feng's selfless sword formation in this world. Nyetian nodded slightly, then his figure moved like a sword light, directly entering the 7 wounds sword formation. What a domineering sword intent! The moment he entered the formation, Nyetian immediately felt the terrifying sword intent in the void around him. He couldn't help but feel his heart tighten, and he exclaimed. He was already prepared in his heart, knowing that after he entered the formation, his sword intent would definitely be suppressed, because he was facing a legendary swordsman in the realm of one with the sword. But he didn't expect Yin Feng's selfless sword intent to be so domineering. At this moment, he felt like his whole body was being pressed against by countless sharp swords. If he moved even a little, the sharp swords would instantly tear him to pieces. Compared to the Yang God Sword Emperor, Yin Feng's selfless sword intent was more ferocious and sharp. But he quickly calmed down, took a deep breath, then slowly closed his eyes, carefully feeling the sword intent in the surrounding space. What is Nyetian doing? Qing Qi saw from afar that Nyetian was not moving, and he couldn't help but frown and ask. Not bad. Elder Shur pursed his lips and smiled, praising. Once an ordinary swordsman entered the 7 wounds sword formation, they would feel an extremely strong sword intent pressure, and then immediately panic, directly triggering the sword formation's killing intent, and be killed on the spot. Although Nyetian's realm was not high, and he was very young, his state of mind was much better than an ordinary swordsman's. According to Elder Shur's observation, if Nyetian directly resisted just now, he would most likely be a corpse. But next, can you break through the first sword intent pressure? Elder Shur then smiled and said, the first sword intent pressure will get stronger and stronger. The more you hesitate, the more dangerous it will be. The first sword intent pressure of the 7 wounds sword formation would get stronger and stronger, and in this way, Nyetian would be in more and more danger. Bang! Just as he finished speaking, Nyetian, who was in the sword formation, moved. The sword intent around him burst forth, and he actually forcefully broke through the sword intent pressure. Such a scene made Elder Shur's eyes narrow, and he immediately let out a cry of surprise. He didn't expect Nyetian's sword intent to be so strong that it could easily break through the first sword intent pressure. It seemed like Nyetian was much stronger than he imagined. Inside the sword formation, Nyetian had just broken through the first sword intent pressure when he immediately felt a terrifying killing intent above his head. It made his heart quiver. In that instant, he didn't raise his head. Instead, he swung his sword, and a terrifying sword intent shot up into the sky, resisting the pressure above his head. Bang! After a muffled sound, Nyetian's body shook, and he spat out a mouthful of fresh blood. His face was as white as paper. Idiot! Elder Shur frowned and thought, it seems like I overestimated you. You dare to fight against the 7 wounds sword formation head-on. You are seeking death. The 7 wounds sword formation was extremely overbearing, but Nye Tian chose to fight it head-on. This was seeking death. Even so, the sword intent pressure still couldn't kill Nye Tian. It merely injured him. Nye Tian. Qing Qi saw that Nye Tian was injured and couldn't help but panic. He will be fine. Trust him, Rui Qianyu, who was standing to the side, said calmly. Qing Qi's eyebrows furrowed. It seemed that everyone who was close to Nye Tian had an indescribable trust in him. No wonder he is a swordsman who has become one with the sword. His sword intent is indeed strong. Inside the sword formation, Nye Tian steadied himself. Blood still dripped from the corner of his mouth, but his eyes were shining with excitement. He had fought against many swordsmen of the same level and had never lost. But now, against the 7 wounds sword formation, he lost. He could feel that this was a sword intent of the same level as him, but it easily defeated him. This meant that Yin Feng Anata, who was of the same level, was much stronger than him. Chapter 4275. Yin Feng Wu's 7 wounds sword essence was incomparably powerful. Within its domineering aura, it was even scarier than the Yang God Sword Emperor's. But at this moment, Nye Tian did not feel the slightest bit of fear. All he felt was a strong desire to fight. Just then, within the 7 wounds sword array, a clear hum of a sword rang out. Then, a shadow of a sword appeared. Immediately, the surrounding space was shrouded in a murderous aura. What a terrifying killer's intent! Nye Tian's heart skipped a beat. He quickly retreated and swung the sky sword in his hand. The shadow of the sword was like a dragon, howling and roaring. Bang! In the next moment, the 2 shadows of the sword clashed together. A terrifying wave of sword waves formed and chilling killer's intent spread. Caught off guard, Nye Tian's shoulder was cut to the bone. Nye Tian steadied himself, still fearless. The corner of his lips curled into a cold smile. He was like a bloodthirsty beast. Then, several more shadows of the sword appeared. Every time they landed, they left a deep cut on his body. In the blink of an eye, he was covered in blood. It was a tragic sight. Qing Qi witnessed this scene from outside the array. His eyes trembled uncontrollably and his heart was in his throat. At this moment, even Rui Qianyu's expression changed. She was visibly nervous. Elder Shur frowned. He did not look worried, but rather confused. He did not think that Nye Tian would be able to last this long within the 7 wounds sword array. Ordinary swordsmen, once injured by the 7 wounds sword essence, would immediately lose their ability to fight. However, Nye Tian was clearly heavily injured, and yet he was still standing. This was truly puzzling. Once the 7 wounds sword essence enters the body, it will destroy the swordsman's internal organs. This kid has been injured to this extent by the 7 wounds sword essence, yet he seems to be fine. This is too strange. Elder Shur's eyes were bright as he thought to himself, could it be that his sword essence can really contend against the 7 wounds sword essence? The only explanation for the fact that Nye Tian was injured and didn't fall was that the sword intent within his body wasn't any weaker than the 7 injuries sword intent. Therefore, he was able to resist the power of the 7 injuries sword intent. Of course, Shur Lao could also see that Nye Tian's martial body was far more powerful than other martial artists of the same level. Not only that, it was much more powerful. He was simply a freak. Senior Evil Dominator, can this sword array be stopped? Qing Qi anxiously asked as he watched Nye Tian's injuries worsen. The 7 injuries sword formation operates on its own and is not affected by external forces. Elder Shur frowned and said, Nye Tian can come out of the sword array now, but it seems that he doesn't want to give up. This is bad. Qing Qi suddenly panicked. How could he not understand Nye Tian's personality? He would not turn back even if he crashed into a wall. Before their eyes there were only two outcomes. Nie Tian would either pass the sword array or die within it. Judging from the current situation, the latter was undoubtedly more likely. Inside the sword array, Nie Tian was bathed in blood, but he still stood there coldly. His eyes were filled with an unyielding light. The 7 injuries sword intent is indeed terrifying. I want to see how much my martial body can withstand. The corner of Nie Tian's mouth twitched. His eyes were filled with a profound smile. Then, the sword shadows fell one after another. He did not evade but instead fought them head-on. Every time a sword mark appeared on his body, the impact on his martial body increased. Very quickly, his body was covered in sword marks. His entire body was covered in blood, and there was not a single piece of skin left unscathed. Nie Tian, what are you doing? Qing Qi was shocked by the scene before him and growled. In his opinion, Nie Tian clearly had a more reliable way to deal with the 7 injuries sword intent. But the latter chose to fight it head-on. This was simply asking for death. If Nie Tian had purposely avoided it, he would have been injured but not so badly. Rui Qianyu's brows were tightly locked together. While she was worried, she seemed to be thinking about something. She knew Nie Tian very well. He must have a plan. Otherwise, he would not have put himself in such great danger. What Nie Tian was best at was putting himself at death's door. Is this young man crazy? Elder Shi did not understand Nie Tian at all, but he was very confused. He could tell that Nie Tian was purposely letting the 7 injuries sword intent enter his martial body. But to anyone else, this was tantamount to self-harm. However, Elder Shi had to admit that Nie Tian's martial body was indeed very powerful. It was much more powerful than he had imagined. Such a terrifying 7 injuries sword intent, even a holy emperor would not be able to withstand it. But Nie Tian was still standing. Such a martial body and such willpower was truly terrifying. Come, let me see exactly how terrifying the 7 injuries sword intent that can inflict 7 injuries with one strike is. Inside the sword array, Nie Tian seemed to have lost his mind. He no longer resisted and allowed the rays of sword intent to penetrate his body. His body was no longer just a mess of blood and flesh. It was completely deformed. Elder Shi and the others stared at Nie Tian in shock. They could not imagine what kind of willpower a martial artist must possess to not collapse under such circumstances. This madman! Elder Shi could not hold it in any longer and he growled. Just as he finished speaking, Nie Tian, who was inside the sword array, made his move. Nie Tian stood still, bathed in blood. With a thought, the demonic energy inside his body burst forth. Terrifying life force exploded and lines of demonic and divine inscriptions appeared. His wounds began to heal at an extremely fast speed. This! Elder Shi could not believe what he saw. His eyes widened to the point that his eyeballs were about to fall out of their socket. Nie Tian's martial body was broken into pieces by the 7 injuries sword intent. How could it still heal? Just what kind of power was hidden inside Nie Tian's body? Just as Elder Shi was wondering, something even more horrifying happened. Break! Within the sword formation, the corner of Nie Tian's mouth twitched and he growled. Then, the sword intent in his body suddenly burst out, and like a landslide or tsunami, a majestic sword intent suddenly rushed out, and like a hidden dragon breaking out of the abyss, it attacked the 7 wounds sword formation. Bang! Crack, crack, crack! In the next second, a muffled rumble echoed. The entire sword array shook violently. Then, it began to crumble. Immediately after, before the Grand Elder and the others could react, the sword formation actually exploded with a loud bang and directly collapsed. The collapse of the sword array triggered a boundless amount of energy that rolled in all directions. Elder Shi and the others, under the force of this attack, could not help but retreat. After a long while, the force of the attack slowly dissipated. However, Elder Shur and the others stood rooted to the ground as if they were petrified. It finally broke. In the air above the demonic peak, Nyetian smiled. His face was as white as paper and his silhouette was like a withered leaf in the wind. How is this possible? Far away, Elder Shur finally reacted. He screamed in shock as he stared at the blood-soaked swordsman in the sky. To his surprise, he completely understood how Nyetian had broken the sword formation. Just then, the demonic peak suddenly rumbled and began to shake as if it was about to collapse. Chapter 4276. Rumble. The demonic mountain shook violently, and a series of roars spread, as if the heaven and earth were about to collapse. Nyetian took a deep breath, and his figure moved, retreating thousands of meters away. Bang! Boom boom boom! At the next moment, an explosion sounded, and suddenly the demonic mountain collapsed. The huge mountain crashed to the ground, stirring up thousands of feet of dust. Nyetian's figure retreated again, avoiding the impact of the airwaves. Seeing this, Qing-Chi directly flew to Nyetian's side and said nervously, "Nyetian, are you okay?" "I'm fine." Nyetian took a deep breath and forced a smile. He was seriously injured, but his life was not in danger. Qing-Chi sensed Nyetian's injury while injecting origin energy into the latter's body. After a while, Nyetian's complexion improved a little, and his injury was much more stable. What a strong sword essence aura! Nyetian gazed at the collapsed Heaven Demon Mountain and sensed an unusually powerful sword intent surging in the mountain, as if there was a giant beast hiding underground, ready to make a move. This aura, it should be the selfless sword demon. Qing-Chi also felt the restless sword essence aura, and his eyes trembled slightly as he said in a low voice, "Boom!" Just as the two of them finished speaking, the collapsed Sky Demon Mountain suddenly exploded. Immediately, a majestic sword chi shot into the sky, pressing down on the surrounding space and causing it to suddenly tighten. It was enveloped by a terrifying sword intent, making it hard for people to breathe. A sense of pressure. Puff! Suddenly, Nyetian felt the sword essence in his body agitated, and he suddenly spat out a mouthful of blood. Nyetian. Qing-Chi couldn't help but change his expression, and once again injected origin energy into Nyetian to help him stabilize his aura. Nyetian took a deep breath, and then he slightly calmed down. There were still remnants of the 7 injuries sword essence in his body. The sword aura just now triggered the 7 injuries sword essence, and once again caused an impact on his martial body. After so many years, I have finally waited. At this moment, an incomparably majestic voice rang out, after which 10,000 beams of sword light blotted out the skies as a tyrannical silhouette appeared, akin to a peerless sword, standing tall between the heavens and earth. In the room. What a powerful aura! Nyetian felt the oppressive aura and couldn't help but tremble in shock. However, in the next moment, he could not help but frown when he saw the figure in the sky. He couldn't believe his eyes. Standing in the middle of the 10,000 sword lights was an extremely short and fat old man. The old man's figure was exactly the same as Jean de Beo's from before. The only difference was that he was much smaller. Could this be the legendary selfless sword demon? In the world of martial arts, strength was everything, so looks were not that important. However, if he grew up to look like the old man in front of him, he would feel a little strange. Ha! Quick, let this sovereign see who exactly broke this sovereign's sword formation. At this moment, the old man laughed and his figure moved. Like a ray of light, he instantly descended in front of Nyetian. This guy is Yin Feng Wua. Nyetian frowned. He finally confirmed that this short and fat old man was the legendary selfless sword demon. It's you. Yin Feng Wua looked at Nyetian with a wrinkled face, as if he didn't believe it and was a little disappointed at the same time. Nyetian also looked at Yin Feng Wua with a strange feeling in his heart. When he looked at Yin Feng Wua from afar, Yin Feng Wuo wasn't too short. Now that he was in front of him, he could see clearly that Yin Feng Wuo was only the height of a 10-year-old child. What was even more strange was that although Yin Feng Wuo's hair and beard were all white, there was not a single wrinkle on his face. His skin was also very white and tender. He didn't look like an old man at all, but more like a fat baby wearing a fake beard. Who would have thought that an existence comparable to the Sun God Sword Emperor would be like this? Then, Yin Feng Wuo looked at Nie Tian, the corner of his mouth twitched, and said angrily, "Kid, I asked you a question, didn't you hear me?" Junior Nie Tian. Nie Tian just reacted and immediately bowed. "I was lucky enough to break your sword formation, please don't blame me, Senior." Blame? Yin Feng Wuo couldn't help but feel a little funny, and said, "The reason why I left the 7 wounds sword formation is to let others break it. You broke the sword formation, of course I'm happy, there's nothing to blame." "Thank you, Senior." Nie Tian quickly nodded and said with a smile. However, he could see from Yin Feng Wuo's expression that the latter wasn't very happy. "Old Feng, congratulations on coming out of seclusion." At this time, Shi Lao came and slightly cupped his hands towards Yin Feng Wuo, and said with a hearty smile. Yin Feng Wuo waved his hand impatiently, his eyes staring straight at Nie Tian, as if he was looking for something. After a moment, he suddenly laughed and said in a loud voice, "Little Nie, you really are a sword Dao freak." Sword Dao freak? Shi Lao and Qing Qi couldn't help but stare at Nie Tian when they heard this. Yin Feng Wuo, of course, knew what the two of them were thinking and said, "You two can't figure out how Nie Tian could break my sword formation, right?" "Yes." Shi Lao and Qing Qi nodded at the same time, waiting for Yin Feng Wuo to explain. Although they saw Nie Tian break the sword formation with their own eyes, they couldn't figure out how Nie Tian did it. Yin Feng Wuo looked at Nie Tian and said, "Little boy, you're very cunning. With your own sword intent, you can't break the 7 wounds sword formation. But your martial physique is very special, it can integrate different sword intents and powers. So you didn't hesitate to hurt yourself, and drew the 7 wounds sword intent into your body. The intent entered your body, and then you used your own sword intent to integrate the 7 wounds sword intent. At the last moment, you burst out a stronger power and broke the sword formation in one fell swoop. Senior is wise, I did take advantage of the situation." Nie Tian nodded and said with a faint smile. He did use the 7 wounds sword intent in the sword formation to break the sword formation, it was indeed a trick. But he also took a great risk by doing so, and he almost lost his life. So that's how it is. Shi Lao and Qing Qi were both smart people. Hearing Yin Feng Wuo's explanation, they immediately understood. It was no wonder that in the sword formation, Nie Tian fought the 7 wounds sword intent, and even led the sword intent into his body. It was to integrate the 7 wounds sword intent. It had to be said that this move was too dangerous, a little carelessness would lead to eternal damnation. As Yin Feng Wuo said, Nie Tian couldn't break the 7 wounds sword formation with his own strength, so he could only take the risk. In terms of sword Dao, Nie Tian was indeed inferior to Yin Feng Wuo. However, his martial body and bloodline were powerful, allowing him to break through the sword formation. "Senior, you don't seem to be satisfied with me," Nie Tian asked carefully as he looked at Yin Feng Wuo. "Yes." Yin Feng Wuo nodded and said, "Back then, I set up the 7 wounds sword formation to find a swordsman who was on par with me in terms of sword essence. In this case, when he stepped into the realm of one with the sword, you are now qualified to be my opponent." Chapter 4277. Hearing Yin Feng Wuo's sigh, Nie Tian couldn't help but frown. It turned out that Yin Feng Wuo had set up the sword array to find an opponent for him. Unfortunately, Nie Tian was too weak. He didn't know how long it would take for him to become as strong as Yin Feng Wuo. With a smile, Nie Tian asked, "Senior, do you still stand by what you said before?" "Of course. Although I am not very satisfied with you, you did break the sword array. From now on, you are my sworn brother. If anyone bullies you in the future, I will stand up for you. Infeng Wua knew what Nye Tian was thinking. Infeng Wua said directly, "Thank you, big brother." Nye Tian was overjoyed and bowed slightly to Infeng Wua. "Old Feng, you came out of seclusion this time, and there is another good news." At this time, Elder Shur walked over and chuckled. He looked at Raindrop Thousand Leaf and said, "Why don't you guess who she is?" Infeng Wua raised his eyebrows and stared at Rui Qianyu for a long time. Suddenly, he thought of something and his expression changed. "Empress of 10 Annihilation. You can tell." This time, it was Elder Shur's turn to be surprised. He didn't expect Infeng Wua to be able to guess Rui Qianyu's identity directly. This should be the first time Infeng Wua saw the Empress. How did he know? Her Majesty is a member of the clan of 10 Annihilation, and her bloodline aura is far stronger than that of the ordinary clan of 10 Annihilation. In addition to your attitude towards the Empress, I would be too stupid if I couldn't tell. Infeng Wua looked at Elder Shur and said in a deep voice, "Old Feng, are you not happy that the Empress has appeared?" Elder Shur nodded and frowned when he saw that Infeng Wua didn't seem happy. "Happy? Why should I be happy?" Infeng Wua sneered with a cold face. "This." Elder Shur's face stiffened. He was stunned for a moment and said, "The Empress is the hope of the Ghost Clan for millions of years. Don't you want her to appear?" Infeng Wua chuckled and said, "It's true that the female monarch is the hope of the ghost race, but the appearance of the female monarch will inevitably attract some mysterious forces. I'm afraid the ghost race will never have a peaceful day." "So what?" The Grand Elder's face darkened and he sternly said, "It's still better than being holed up here." Infeng Wua shook his head helplessly. Then, he looked at Nye Tian and said, "Nye Tian, your relationship with the Empress shouldn't be simple, right? You risked your life to challenge the 7 wounding sword formation so that I could come out of seclusion, right? Big brother is wise." Nye Tian smiled faintly. "You've said a lot, brother. Royu's awakening of the 10 Destruction bloodline has not only alarmed the ghost race, but it's also alarmed a great organization lurking in the Saints' world." Infeng Wua frowned and said, "Let me guess, it's the Human Emperor Palace, right?" "Yes." Infeng Wua guessed correctly, causing Nye Tian to be stunned. Then, he nodded and said, "The people from the Human Emperor Palace have already taken action, and we almost died in the hands of the Pavilion Master of the Heaven Dao Sacred Pavilion." As he spoke, Nye Tian briefly recounted what had happened, causing Infeng Wua to frown. "Old Feng, it's our responsibility to protect the Empress. You won't reject it, right?" The Grand Elder asked worriedly when he saw Infeng Wua's stern expression. "Fourth brother, how much do you know about the Human Emperor Palace?" Infeng Wua frowned and asked in a deep voice. "This." The Grand Elder's face stiffened and he shook his head. His understanding of the Human Emperor Palace was limited to hearsay, and he had no idea what kind of organization it was. The Human Emperor Palace was established when the Saints' world first appeared, and we don't know how long they have ruled the Saints' world. Infeng Wua frowned and said, "The Human Emperor Palace is mysterious and extremely powerful, but they have very few members. They never have more than 10 people. Other than the Human Emperor, there are usually 6 to 9 elders. The Heaven Dao Pavilion Master should be an elder of the Human Emperor Palace." "Elder?" The Grand Elder's eyes darkened, and he said in shock, "You mean that there are at least 6 other experts like the Heaven Dao Pavilion Master in the Human Emperor Palace?" The Heaven Dao Pavilion Master was an expert who stood at the peak of the Saints' world, and was even known as the #1 person in the Saints' world. Although this title was somewhat exaggerated, it was extremely difficult to find someone who could stand shoulder to shoulder with the Heaven Dao Pavilion Master, at least on the surface. Even so, the Grand Elder was shocked that the Heaven Dao Pavilion Master was only an elder of the Human Emperor Palace. It was hard to imagine how terrifying the human emperor behind him was. I speculate that the Heaven Dao Pavilion Master's strength should be the lowest in the human emperor palace. Otherwise, he wouldn't be the Heaven Dao Pavilion Master. Yin Feng Wua smiled bitterly and shook his head. This. The Grand Elder was stunned and his face froze. It was terrifying that the Heaven Dao Pavilion Master was the lowest in the human emperor palace. Yin Feng Wua let out a long sigh and recalled some past events. He said, "Back then, the Yang God was also hunted by the human emperor palace, and he even fought with the human emperor at that time, but he lost miserably. That was the only defeat of the Yang God in his life." The human emperor didn't kill him? Nie Tian couldn't help but ask with a frown. I don't know why the human emperor didn't kill the Yang God. Yin Feng Wua shook his head. This was also something that he didn't understand back then. Could it be that the Yang God also joined the human emperor palace? The Grand Elder suddenly thought of something and asked in surprise. I don't know. Yin Feng Wua shook his head again. He had such a guess before, but he felt that the Yang God wouldn't want to join the human emperor palace. Human emperor, elder. At this moment, Nie Tian suddenly thought of something, and he couldn't help but frown. He had a vague guess in his mind. Yu Tsangqiong was the human emperor, and he had once ordered Di Kashu and the Qi demon god to find the dragon shepherds and the celestial pole. This meant that Di Kashu and the Qi demon god were most likely the elders of the human emperor palace back then. Even the first emperor of the angel clan might be an elder of the human emperor palace, because he had also received guidance from Yu Tsangqiong. It was hard to imagine that the elders of the human emperor palace were existences at the level of Di Kashu and the Qi demon god. Then, how terrifying must the human emperor be? Nie Tian, what are you thinking about? Yin Feng Wua saw Nie Tian's strange expression, so he raised his head and asked. Nothing. Nie Tian calmed down and smiled faintly, but he didn't tell the Grand Elder his guess. Fourth brother, with our strength, we can't protect the female emperor. Yin Feng Wua frowned, then looked at the Grand Elder and sighed. The people of the human emperor palace won't go to the 1,000 layers of ghosts, will they? The Grand Elder's eyes trembled slightly, and he was obviously a little scared. Definitely. Yin Feng Wua nodded and said, the human emperor palace will never give up on those they want to kill. The female emperor carries the prophecy of destruction, and the human emperor palace will never let it go. Then what should we do? The Grand Elder's eyes narrowed and his voice was trembling. If the human emperor palace was really as powerful as Yin Feng Wua said, wouldn't a few elders be able to destroy the entire 1,000 layers of ghosts? Chapter 4278. Meet the Human Sovereign? Everyone frowned and their expressions changed when they heard Yin Feng Wua's words. Did Yin Feng Wua know the human sovereign? Yin Feng Wua glanced at the crowd and said with a faint smile, I met the young human sovereign many years ago. After so many years, the young human sovereign should be the real human sovereign now. The young human sovereign? Shi Lao and the others were stunned again. I don't want to say too much about the human sovereign palace. Yin Feng Wua frowned and looked at Nie Tian. Nie Tian, I need a companion to meet the human sovereign this time. Are you willing to go with me? Me? Nie Tian couldn't help but be taken aback. If he was going to meet the human emperor, shouldn't Yin Feng Wua need a powerful companion? For example, the Grand Elder, or some other romantic person. Why did he choose a burden? Yes, you. Yin Feng Wua nodded and looked at Nie Tian with certainty. Old Feng, are you going to bring him? Shi Lao seemed to have thought of something and his expression changed. He was shocked and did not finish his sentence. Yin Feng Wua nodded and did not explain anything. He smiled and said, Nie Tian is a good candidate. If this trip is successful, not only will it solve the problem of the human sovereign palace, but it will also greatly improve Nie Tian's strength. Seeing that the two of them were acting so mysteriously, Nie Tian's interest was piqued. He asked, Big brother, where are you taking me? In Feng Wua smiled and said, "You don't need to know too much now. Just answer me. Are you willing or not?" Qing Chi looked at Nie Tian and his eyes flickered. Obviously, he wanted Nie Tian to agree. It was not easy for In Feng Wua to think so highly of him. Nie Tian was still too weak and needed to improve quickly. "Can I go with you?" Rui Qianyu asked before Nie Tian could speak. The corner of In Feng Wu's lips twitched as he smiled. "Your Majesty, I'm afraid you won't be able to go to that place despite your noble status." Rui Qianyu's beautiful eyes darkened, and she did not speak anymore. "Nie Tian, the human sovereign palace will not give up. Our trip concerns the safety of the Empress. If we succeed, the human sovereign palace will not dare to step into the thousand-layer ghost region for at least a few hundred years." In Feng Wua was very shrewd and could tell that Nie Tian was worried about Yuqian. Yi said with a smile. Nie Tian's eyes flickered as he nodded. "All right, I'll go with you." In Feng Wua smiled again. He looked directly at Raindrop Qianye and said, "Rest assured, Your Majesty. I will definitely bring Nie Tian back safely." Rui Qianyu glanced at In Feng Wua and stared at Nie Tian for a long time. Finally, she nodded. She knew that Nie Tian and In Feng Wua were going to the unknown place for her, but she did not want Nie Tian to risk his life for her. That was why she was hesitating. But now that Nie Tian had made up his mind, she could not stop him. "Rui, I will be fine." Nie Tian knew that Rui Qianyu was worried and said with a smile. Rui Qianyu nodded and did not speak. "Elder Shi, Senior Qing Qi, I will leave Ryu in your hands." Nie Tian smiled and bowed to Elder Shi and Qing Qi. Elder Shi smiled and said, "Brother Nie, don't worry. With I around, nothing will happen to the Empress even if the human sovereign palace goes to the thousand-layer ghost region." Qing Qi also smiled and nodded. Nie Tian smiled and secretly told Qing Qi to look for Jun Jianqing on his behalf. Ever since Jun Jianqing left, there had been no news of him, which made Nie Tian very worried. Nie Tian had been very busy during this period and could not find Jun Jianqing, so he could only ask Qing Qi for help. Then, In Feng Wua and Nie Tian left without delay. Rui Qianyu looked at Nie Tian's back with a sad look. She did not want to be under Nie Tian's protection all the time. She wanted to stand side by side with Nie Tian one day and fight against the wind and rain together. After bidding farewell to Rui Qianyu and the others, In Feng Wua quickly left the thousand-layer ghost region with Nie Tian and entered the ghost crossing Blood River. 3 days later, Nie Tian and In Feng Wua entered an underwater tunnel under the ghost crossing Blood River. "Big brother, what is this place?" Nie Tian looked at the tunnel ahead and could not see the end. He could not help but ask. He did not expect such a wide tunnel to be hidden under the ghost crossing Blood River. "This tunnel is called the Yellow Springs Path. It's the entrance to another world." In Feng Wua was in high spirits and said with a smile, "A long time ago, probably before the All-Heaven Sacred World was separated, the ghost crossing Blood River was still a complete river. The river winds through the entire All-Heaven Saints world. It is the birthplace of the Gui clan, and the Gui clan calls it the Mother River. Not long after the ghost race was born, the ghost crossing Blood River experienced a great calamity. A terrible evil force suddenly appeared in the river, and it was extremely lethal to the people of the ghost race. At that time, the 4 branches of the ghost race suffered heavy casualties and were even in danger of being exterminated. At the most critical moment, someone discovered the Yellow Springs Path under the ghost crossing Blood River. Then, the surviving ghost race members moved to the Yellow Springs Path and lived here for tens of thousands of years until the evil power disappeared. Therefore, the Yellow Springs Path is the path to save the ghost race. Without it, the ghost race would have disappeared long ago." "I see." Nie Tian could not help but exclaim in shock. He did not expect the tiny Yellow Springs Path to have saved the ghost race. The Yellow Springs Path was very big in the past, dozens of times wider than it is now. Yin Feng Wua smiled again and said, but at some point in time, the Yellow Springs path began to slowly shrink. Now, it is only a tenth of its former size. Nie Tian found it strange and asked, did the ghost race not think of expanding the Yellow Springs path? Of course they did. Yin Feng Wua smiled bitterly and said, but the structure of the underworld path is special and complicated. Every expansion ended in failure. There was even a time when the ghost crossing Blood River was shaken and the entire underworld path was almost destroyed. The entire Yellow Springs path was almost submerged. Since then, the ghost race no longer dared to casually change the Yellow Springs path. Yin Feng Wua sighed and said, the Yellow Springs path is getting narrower and narrower. I don't know how many more years it can last. Nie Tian heard the sadness in her voice, and his face immediately became much more serious. The Yellow Springs path used to be the lifeline of the ghost race, but it was getting narrower and narrower. This seemed to be an ominous sign for the ghost race. Although Yin Feng Wua was a peak swordsman, he was powerless against the shrinking Yellow Springs path. Half a day later, the two finally came to the end of the Yellow Springs path. In front of them was a strange rootless flower floating in the air with dazzling lights, revealing a breathtaking beauty. Chapter 4279. Nie Tian looked at the netherworld flower in front of him, and could not help but be stunned for a long time. This strange rootless flower actually made him feel a strong sense of oppression. It seemed that there was an extremely terrifying existence in the flower. Big brother, in this netherworld flower. After a while, Nie Tian looked at Yin Feng Wua. Before he could finish his words, Yin Feng Wua raised his hand and interrupted him. Yin Feng Wua smiled faintly and said, this flower of the underworld is the flower that guides the way. It is also the gate to another world. Like a space-time channel? Nie Tian asked with a frown. Yes. Yin Feng Wua nodded, and then his face slightly darkened and said, Nie Tian, are you ready? Ready for what? Nie Tian was stunned and asked. Of course, to enter the other world. Yin Feng Wua laughed, and then suddenly the sword essence in his body suddenly broke out, turned into a continuous stream of sword essence, and crazily poured into the netherworld flower. This. Nie Tian was stunned by the scene in front of him, and could not say a word. In the next moment, he suddenly felt a strand of terrifying energy surge out from the nether spring flower, and it was actually like a shapeless and enormous hand that grabbed him tightly. For a moment, he could not breathe. Then, something even more terrible happened. Before he had time to react, he actually passed out under the pressure of the invisible force. After a long time, Nie Tian finally woke up. He opened his eyes slightly and saw a fat face not far away looking at him with a smile. It was Yin Feng Wua. Nie Tian immediately stood up and suddenly felt that something was wrong. He looked up at the sky, and the scene in front of him shocked him on the spot and directly petrified him. In the air, dazzling rootless flowers floated around, covering the entire sky like stars falling from the sky. These rootless flowers were the netherworld flower that Nie Tian had seen before. Nie Tian, this is the new world. When Nie Tian came back to his senses, Yin Feng Wua laughed and said, carefully sense these Yellow Springs flowers and see what you find. Nie Tian frowned. With a thought, he sent his divine sense over. At the same time, he activated his demon eye, pushing his perception to the maximum. He didn't expect there to be so many Yellow Springs flowers here. When he saw how strange the Yellow Springs flower was, he thought that there was only one stalk. He didn't expect it to be so prosperous. This. After a short moment, Nie Tian suddenly noticed something, and his face changed once more in extreme shock. He couldn't believe his eyes. There was actually a human figure at the heart of each Yellow Spring flower. There was no mistaking it. Each of these Yellow Springs flowers had a human figure on it. Did you see it clearly? Yin Feng Wua noticed Nie Tian's reaction, and he knew what the latter had discovered. However, he wasn't surprised and smiled faintly instead. Big brother, Why are there people in the Yellow Springs flower? Nie Tian suppressed the shock in his heart and asked in a deep voice. He sensed that these people had a terrifying sword essence. It seemed that they were all swordsmen. To be exact, they are not people, but souls. Yin Feng Wua smiled again and said, before these people entered the Yellow Springs flower, they were very powerful swordsmen. But now, their flesh and blood have been absorbed by the Yellow Springs flower. Only their souls are left. This. Nie Tian gasped with astonishment. Don't tell me that the Yellow Spring flower is a man-eating flower? It was the first time he saw such a terrible man-eating flower that could absorb the flesh and blood of warriors. Yin Feng Wua, shook his head and said, the owners of these souls were very powerful swordsmen when they were alive. They all voluntarily entered the Yellow Springs flower. Voluntarily? Nie Tian was shocked again. Who would voluntarily let their flesh and blood be absorbed? Nie Tian, do you remember the Yellow Springs flower in the Yellow Springs path? Yin Feng Wua smiled again and asked. Yes. Nie Tian nodded. That was the first Yellow Springs flower he had seen. How could he forget it? That Yellow Springs flower is actually my sword understanding flower, Yin Feng Wua said with a faint smile. Flower of sword comprehension? Nie Tian was taken aback. He didn't understand what that meant. The flower of the netherworld can help a swordsman to comprehend the sword Tao. A swordsman entering a flower of the netherworld means that he has chosen that flower of the netherworld as his flower of sword comprehension. Yin Feng Wua nodded slightly and said, I have entered the Yellow Spring just like them. I used to understand sword principle in the Yellow Springs flower. But I was luckier than them. I was not devoured by the Yellow Springs flower. I see. Nie Tian's pupils shrank and he was shocked. It turned out that the Yellow Springs flower could help swordsmen understand sword principle. No wonder these swordsmen were willing to enter the Yellow Springs flower. The Yellow Springs flower obviously not only helped swordsmen understand sword principle, but it also devoured the power of the swordsman's martial body. The swordsmen in the Yellow Springs flower wanted to use the Yellow Springs flower to understand sword principle, but they did not expect to be devoured by the Yellow Springs flower. These swordsmen's soul bodies were all sword heroes when they were alive. Many of them were even swordsmen who were one step away from becoming one with the sword. They did not care about their lives for sword principle, but they all failed. Yin Feng Wua could not help but sigh. He was very emotional. Big brother, which era were these swordsmen from? I feel that their soul bodies are about to disappear. Nie Tian became cold and asked Yin Feng Wua. Many of them are old fellows from millions of years ago. There are even some swordsmen from the ancient era. After their flesh and blood are absorbed by the Yellow Springs flower, their soul bodies will also be slowly absorbed. In the end, they will completely disappear from this world. I nodded and said, the stronger the swordsman's sword intent when he was alive, the longer his soul body will exist in the Yellow Springs flower. As he said that, his eyes swept across the Yellow Springs flower in the sky and sighed. The soul bodies in the Yellow Springs flower should disappear soon. Sigh. After saying that, he could not help but sigh again. Big brother, what are we doing here? At this moment, Nie Tian suddenly thought of something. His eyes could not help but tremble as he asked. You have already guessed it. Why bother asking me? Yin Feng Wua squinted his eyes and smiled. His face was so full that his eyes could not be seen. You really want me to enter the Yellow Springs flower? Nie Tian's face stiffened and he gulped. He had already guessed that Yin Feng Wua wanted him to enter the Yellow Springs flower to understand sword principle. However, the risk seemed to be a little too big. What if he was careless and got devoured by the Yellow Springs flower? Of course. Otherwise, why are we here? Yin Feng Wua chuckled and said while twirling his beard, however, your mission is very important. It is not as simple as entering the Yellow Springs flower. What else do you want me to do? Nie Tian was speechless. He wanted to strangle the fat old man in front of him. Chapter 4280. Nie Tian's expression changed when he heard Yin Feng Wua mention the human sovereign. Was the human sovereign here? Yin Feng Wua knew what Nie Tian was thinking and said with a faint smile, "He hasn't arrived yet, but he should be here soon." "Big brother, you seem to be familiar with the human sovereign," Nie Tian said with a nod. Yin Feng Wua smiled and said, "When the human sovereign was young, we were friends. I don't know how many years have passed since then." "What kind of person is the human emperor?" Nie Tian asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. Yin Feng Wua was silent for a moment. He seemed to recall a lot of things in the past and said with a sigh. Nie Tian was speechless. The fact that the human sovereign was able to be praised by Yin Feng Wua showed how formidable the human sovereign was. As for being conceited, it was not strange. Any talented warrior would be conceited to some extent. The human sovereign's talent and strength were at the peak, so it was normal for him to be conceited. "Big brother, did you meet the human sovereign here?" Nie Tian asked after thinking for a moment. "Yes." Yin Feng Wua nodded and suddenly asked, "Nie Tian, do you think it's risky to comprehend swordsmanship in the flower of the netherworld?" "It should be very risky." Nie Tian looked at the flower of the netherworld above his head and said, "I'm afraid that less than 1 in 100 swordsmen can come out alive after entering the flower of the netherworld." Yin Feng Wua looked at Nie Tian and could not help but laugh. Then his face darkened and he said, "As far as I know, in the past millions of years, about 1 million swordsmen have come to the holy land of the netherworld to comprehend swordsmanship in the flower of the netherworld. But do you know? How many people have come out of the flower of the netherworld?" "A few thousand?" Nie Tian asked after a moment of pondering upon seeing Yin Feng and Wua's strange expression. He knew that it was impossible for ordinary swordsmen to come to the land of the netherworld. Only the real geniuses of swordsmanship could enter the flower of the netherworld. Among nearly 1 million geniuses of swordsmanship, there should be a few thousand who succeeded. Yin Feng Wua looked at Nie Tian and shook his head with a smile. "A few hundred people?" Nie Tian frowned and asked again. Yin Feng Wua shook his head again. "Only a few dozen people?" Nie Tian's expression changed. Out of nearly 1 million people, only a few dozen had succeeded. Wasn't this a little too risky? But what he didn't expect was that Yin Feng Wua continued to shake his head. This time, Nie Tian's expression completely changed. He said in horror, "It can't be that there are only a few people, right?" "3 people." Yin Feng Wua nodded and said, "Yang God's Sword Emperor, me, and the human emperor." Nie Tian's expression changed again. He opened his mouth slightly as if he wanted to say something, but his tongue didn't seem to listen to him. No matter how hard he tried, he couldn't speak. Never in his wildest dreams would he have imagined that out of almost 1 million genius swordsmen, only 3 had succeeded in comprehending the sword. This was not a simple 3 out of 1 million, because these 1 million people were all extremely powerful swordsmen. They were all rare existences among swordsmen. Even so, only 3 people had succeeded in comprehending the sword. From this, it could be seen how dangerous it was to comprehend the sword in the netherworld. Back then, Yang God was the first to come to the netherworld Holy Land, and also the first to succeed in comprehending the sword and become one with the sword. After a while, when Nie Tian calmed down a little, Yin Feng Wua said, "I came to the netherworld Holy Land earlier than Yang God. But because of some things in the Ghost Clan, I entered the netherworld flower to comprehend the sword a little later. The human emperor was the last of the 3 of us to comprehend the sword in the netherworld. At that time, he should be about the same age as you are now. He was very young, and his strength wasn't strong at all. But in the end, he was the only one who succeeded in comprehending the sword." Speaking of this, Yin Feng Wua seemed to recall the turbulent years of the past. And felt a lot of emotions. Nie Tian was shocked and didn't react for a long time. After a long time, Nie Tian looked at Yin Fenghua and asked, "Big brother, is it possible to become one with the sword after successfully comprehending the sword in the netherworld?" "Of course not." Yin Fenghua shook his head and said, "Comprehending the sword in the netherworld will greatly improve the sword intent of the swordsman. Once it succeeds, it will prove that the swordsman has the aptitude to become one with the sword. Before Yang God comprehended the sword in the netherworld, he was already at the peak of the saint realm. So when he walked out of the netherworld flower, he directly became one with the sword." "What about you?" Nie Tian's eyes trembled and he couldn't help asking. Yang God was born with a sword embryo. His innate conditions are not comparable to ordinary people. Yin Fenghua sighed softly and said, "Back then, I also entered the netherworld flower in the saint realm of sword martial arts. Unfortunately, after I succeeded in comprehending the sword, I still couldn't become one with the sword. But Huang comprehending the sword in the netherworld has greatly improved me. At least when I fight with Yang God, I won't be crushed like before." Speaking of this, there seemed to be unwillingness in his eyes. He had to admit that Yang God's sword emperor was indeed stronger than him. "What about the human emperor?" Nie Tian continued to ask. When the human emperor entered the netherworld flower, he was only in the god-defying sword sense, but after he succeeded in comprehending the sword, he was already at the peak of saint realm of sword martial arts. Yin Fenghua nodded slightly and said, "Comprehending the sword in the netherworld flower has greatly improved the human emperor. But after leaving Huang, I haven't heard any news about the human emperor since the land of the netherworld flower. It's as if he has disappeared from this world. After so many years, I'm afraid that the human emperor has already become one with the sword," Nie Tian said with a gloomy look. Yin Fenghua nodded and said, "I speculate that the current human emperor's understanding of the sword principle is infinitely close to the limit. If he comes back, he will definitely be the best in the sword world." Nie Tian frowned. He could see that Yin Fenghua seemed to be a little afraid of the human emperor. "Big brother, how can we see the human emperor?" Nie Tian asked with a gloomy look. "Since I brought you to the netherworld holy land, I naturally have to open the netherworld flower. When the netherworld flower opens, the human emperor will soon come. Come with me." Yin Fenghua smiled faintly and then moved. He turned into a sword light in the air and flew away. Seeing this, Nie Tian immediately followed. After a while, the two of them came to a hidden valley. In front of them, there was a simple, sword-shaped gate. "This is the gate of the netherworld." With a faint smile, Yin Fenghua signaled Nie Tian not to step forward. Then, he took a step forward, and the sword intent inside of him burst out. His whole body was like a bottomless abyss of sword intent, and endless sword intent surged madly. Endless sword will surged wildly like a tide toward the gate of the netherworld. Chapter 4281. Boom, boom, boom. Nie Tian stared at the gate of Yellow Spring and could clearly hear the roar of the sword will. He was shocked. The sword will around Yin Feng's selfless wind surged like the sea. Waves of sword will rolled and roared, constantly attacking the gate of Yellow Spring. Nie Tian felt the terrifying sword will around him and truly witnessed the terror of Yin Feng's selfless wind. It was hard to imagine that this ball-like fat old man actually contained such a terrifying and enormous sword intent within his body. He was like a sea of sword intent, majestic and boundless. In comparison, Nie Tian's sword will was like a ditch, almost dried up. Gate of Yellow Spring, open. At this moment, Yin Feng's sword will soared to the extreme. He roared and the huge sword will suddenly erupted, turning into a sword of 7 wounds. It gathered the power of a dragon and rushed towards the gate of Yellow Spring. Buzz. In the next moment, the gate of the netherworld hummed and opened wide like a giant beast opening its bloody mouth. "It's open!" Nie Tian's heart skipped a beat. He stared at the gate of Yellow Spring and saw the underworld sea of swords floating in the air, revealing its true appearance. The underworld sea of swords was a sea of sword wool floating in the air. From its outward appearance, it was like a blunt sword that lay horizontally in midair, yet if one were to look carefully, one would notice that the sword inside within it surged violently like waves, and even if one was extremely far away, one could still clearly hear the sword howl. Nie Tian took a deep breath and prepared to approach the Yellow Spring Sea of Swords. However, at that very moment, the Yellow Spring Sea of Swords shuddered violently, and then countless streams of sword intent shot into the sky, morphing into countless sword shadows that shot into the heavens. Nie Tian suddenly felt a wave of sword will. His heart trembled and the wings of Star Soul appeared on his back. With a flap of the wings, he instantly retreated. Although he reacted in time, he was still a little too slow. The endless sword will press down on him, making him feel a tightness in his chest, and almost spit out a mouthful of blood. "Are you okay?" Yin Feng's selfless wind retreated to Nie Tian's side and asked with a faint smile. "I'm fine." Nie Tian let out a long sigh of relief and immediately felt the tightness in his chest lessen. "You broke through the heavenly sword calamity so easily. You're really lucky, kid." Yin Fengwu looked at Nie Tian and chuckled. Nie Tian couldn't help but furrow his brows. Sensing the sword will, he was taken aback and laughed. He hadn't expected that the pressure from the sword intent would actually allow him to break through to the sword heavenly tribulation realm. If a swordsman wants to comprehend the sword in the Yellow Springs, he must at least reach the sword heavenly tribulation realm. "I wanted to help you break through, but I didn't expect you to break through on your own." Yin Fengwu laughed, but he was surprised. Previously, he had always thought that Nie Tian's talent in the sword Dao was not top-notch, and the reason why he could break the 7 injuries sword formation was largely due to his luck. But now, he vaguely felt that he was wrong. Perhaps there was a power in Nie Tian that even he couldn't see through. The pressure from the sword will just now would have seriously injured even a genius in sword Dao. But not only was Nie Tian not injured, but he also broke through. It was incredible. It could be said that breaking the 7 injuries sword formation was an accident, and breaking through under the pressure of the sword will was also an accident. But if accidents happened frequently, then it could only be inevitable. Yin Fengwu felt that he had underestimated his sworn brother. "Big brother, what is this sword sea?" Nie Tian calmed down a little. Looking at the countless sword shadows in the sky, he couldn't help but ask. "This is the underworld sword sea. Once the gate of the underworld is opened, countless sword shadows will be released. These sword shadows will release a special aura of sword will. Powerful swordsmen or swordsmen with strong sword will can feel it. Then, they can follow the sword will to enter the holy land of the underworld. Guide them to the Yellow Springs Holy Land," Yin Fengwu explained with a faint smile. Back then, he came to the holy land of the underworld because he felt the sword will of the underworld sword sea. Nie Tian nodded slightly. It turned out that these sword shadows were like guides, guiding swordsmen to this place. Swordsmen at the level of the human sovereign realm, of course, would feel the sword will of the underworld sword sea, so they would come soon. "Then, there will be many swordsmen coming here, right?" Nie Tian asked Yin Fengwu. "The sword shadows above the underworld sword sea can last for about half a month. Within half a month, there should be tens of thousands of swordsmen coming here. They will all become your opponents," Yin Fengwu said with a faint smile. "Opponents?" Nie Tian frowned and was a little puzzled. Yin Fengwu smiled again and said, "Do you think anyone can enter the flower of the underworld to comprehend swordsmanship? The flower of the underworld in the holy land of the underworld is limited. Swordsmen must compete for the right to comprehend swordsmanship in the underworld." Nie Tian's face stiffened, and he was speechless for a moment. So many genius swordsmen actually went through all kinds of hardships to enter the holy land of the underworld to fight for their lives. In his opinion, comprehending swordsmanship in the underworld was indeed no different from courting death. It must be known that over millions of years, only 3 people had succeeded in comprehending swordsmanship. It was too terrifying. Even Nye Tian did not have the confidence to walk out of the flower of the underworld alive. Big brother, why don't we hurry up and search for a flower of the underworld before the other swordsmen arrive? Nye Tian became cold and asked with a frown. Yin Feng Wua said, "Do you think you can enter the flower of the underworld at will? The flower of the underworld is a flower of swordsmanship. Under normal circumstances, it is always closed. If you want to make the flower of the underworld bloom, you need at least hundreds of swordsmen who are at the level of sword martial saints Defire to release it at the same time. Only sword wills can make the flower of the underworld sense it." "I see." Nye Tian nodded slightly. By the looks of it, the flower of the underworld they entered the holy land of the underworld should have been easily activated because Yin Feng Wua had trained in it. "Come, I'll bring you to see the flowers of the underworld that have not been activated yet. You can sense their presence beforehand. It will be very helpful for you when you comprehend swordsmanship in the underworld." Yin Feng Wua smiled faintly, then moved. He disappeared. Nye Tian sensed the presence of Yin Feng Wua's sword intent and immediately followed. Soon, under the guidance of Yin Feng Wua, Nye Tian came to a huge basin and immediately sensed the special presence of the flower of the underworld. He went forward and saw that in the huge basin there was a sea of flowers of the underworld. However, these flowers of the underworld were not in a state of blooming. The petals had not bloomed, and they were like huge balls of sword intent lying in the basin. Nye Tian suppressed the shock in his heart and roughly looked around. There were hundreds of flowers of the underworld in the basin, which meant that there were only hundreds of people who were qualified to comprehend swordsmanship in the underworld. According to Yin Feng Wua, there would be tens of thousands of people coming here within half a month. It seemed that the competition was quite fierce. Chapter 4282. Nye Tian was shocked. The sword pressure behind him made him feel like he was submerged in a sea of sword essence. He could not breathe at all. The sword pressure was even more terrifying than Yin Feng Wua's. Could it be the human sovereign? Nye Tian's eyes trembled. He felt like someone had hit his heart. "Brother Yin Feng, how have you been?" Right at this moment, a clear and powerful voice resounded out amidst the surging sword insight, and it was like the spring breeze and rain that instantly dispersed the powerful sword pressure. Only then did Nye Tian feel relieved. He exhaled a mouthful of impure air, and his tense face relaxed. He abruptly turned around and saw a white-robed man standing behind him like a longsword in midair. "Is this the human sovereign?" Nye Tian's heart skipped a beat and his expression changed. He did not feel a particularly powerful aura from the man in white. However, there was a layer of sword essence flowing around the man's body. It was like flowing water. It looked extremely strange. The man's appearance was not outstanding. At most, he was ordinary. However, he was extremely tall, about 2 meters tall. He looked extremely powerful. Was this man the legendary human sovereign? The one who truly ruled the holy world? "Brother Mu." Yin Feng Wua smiled. He twitched the corner of his mouth and said, "Maybe I should call you human sovereign." Sure enough, he's the human emperor. Nye Tian's heart skipped a beat. However, other than the sword pressure, it seemed that the human sovereign was not as powerful as Nye Tian had imagined. "It's just a title. Brother Yin Feng, you don't have to worry about it." The human sovereign smiled. His eyes seemed to wander and glanced at Nye Tian from time to time. "Brother Mu, you must be joking." Yin Feng Wua's eyes narrowed. The human sovereign is not a title. He is the one who truly controls the holy world. The human sovereign smiled without saying anything. "How should I address you?" Suddenly, the human sovereign's eyes became sharp. He stared at Nie Tian and asked. Nie Tian replied with a smile. Star Saint Lord. The corner of the human emperor's lips twitched as he murmured, Dong Wang Jingrong has a successor, I am happy for him. Nie Tian's heart tightened. He didn't expect the other party to be able to see through his identity. Could it be that Ren Huang killed Dong Wang Jingrong? He is my sworn brother. Yin Fenghua smiled and stepped forward to stand in front of Nie Tian. At that moment, he sensed a killing intent from the human emperor. Brother Yin Feng, you are underestimating me. The Ren Huang laughed and said, Why would I attack a junior? Fan are you interested in exchanging a few blows with little brother Nie Tian? As he spoke, his figure suddenly flashed and a young man appeared. He looked at Nie Tian with a smile, seemingly somewhat excited. Nie Tian and Yin Fenghua were both stunned. They hadn't noticed that there was another person behind the human sovereign. Even though Nie Tian wasn't strong, he was very perceptive. He could sense that the young man's sword will was extremely strange. He didn't seem like an ordinary swordsman. It was unbelievable that a swordsman like Yin Fenghua hadn't noticed the young man's existence. Brother Yin Feng, this is my disciple, the next human sovereign, Lin Fan. The human sovereign smiled and introduced the young man. Young human sovereign. Yin Fenghua's pupil shrank. He didn't expect the young man to be the young human sovereign already. One must know that even Mu Jioge, the current human emperor, was only given the title of young human emperor after his strength reached the heaven realm. This young man named Lin Fan looked to be only 17 or 18 years old. In fact, he must be very young, perhaps even younger than Nie Tian. However, he was already known as the young human emperor. This undoubtedly meant that his potential and talent were even higher than Mu Jioge's. Terrifying. Nie Tian, do you want to fight with the young human sovereign? Yin Fenghua looked at Nie Tian and asked. He was asking, but he was also hinting to Nie Tian not to accept the challenge easily. Since Lin Fan was known as the young human sovereign, his strength and talent were definitely not comparable to ordinary geniuses. The human sovereign palace had been lurking in the shadows for a long time. It was the force that truly ruled the all-sacred world. Everyone in it had amazing strength. The young human sovereign definitely had unimaginable talent. Sure, Nie Tian said with a smile and a nod. Of course, he understood Yin Fenghua's meaning. However, if he was afraid to fight now, he would be too evasive. Most importantly, he also wanted to know how strong this young human sovereign was. Fan go and fight with little brother Nie Tian. Don't hurt him, the human sovereign said with a faint smile. Although he said it calmly, it was clear that he had determined that Nie Tian was not Lin Fan's opponent. Yes, master. Lin Fan smiled. His figure moved instantly, and he was as sharp as a sword. Brother Lin, let's fight in 3 swords. How about it? Nie Tian stood up and said. Sure. Lin Fan smiled indifferently. He opened his palm, and a nearly transparent sword appeared. Suddenly, a sharp sword aura spread out. Like an invisible hand, it sealed the surrounding space. What a terrifying sword will! Nie Tian felt the fluctuation of sword will in the surrounding space, and his heart couldn't help but tremble. However, in the next moment, the sky sword appeared in his hand. Sword will surged around him, and the celestial demon reverse mark appeared at the corner of his eyes. It was as if a demon had descended. Interesting. Seeing this, Lin Fan couldn't help but laugh. Then, he said, get ready. I'm going to attack. Nie Tian nodded slightly. The sky sword was held horizontally in front of his chest, and the sword will soared into the sky. The first sword. The corner of Lin Fan's mouth moved slightly, and the sword in his hand moved instantly. Suddenly, a ray of light shot out and attacked. Nie Tian frowned. He actually didn't have time to attack, and a sword mark was left on his shoulder. How is this possible? Nie Tian took a few steps back and stabilized himself. He was extremely shocked. His sword was already considered extremely fast. There had never been anyone who could not even give him a chance to attack. The second sword. At that moment Lin Fan spoke again. The invisible sword flowed like water, and suddenly, it turned into a stormy sword will that pressed down on Nie Tian. Nie Tian's heart trembled again. The sword will in his body shot up into the sky, and he wanted to resist the sword will. However, he found that he couldn't resist at all. Boom! In an instant, his sword will was directly crushed, and he couldn't even hold the sword in his hand. His sword will was too terrifying. It was extremely sharp, and it was extremely huge. Nie Tian had never thought that there would be such a terrifying sword will in this world. What shocked him even more was that Lin Fan's sword realm seemed to be the same as his. It was only the first level of sword disaster. Chapter 4283. In an instant, Nie Tian felt the killing intent. His spiritual soul trembled, and the blood in his body seemed to stagnate. At this moment, he felt that the void around him was filled with incomparably sharp blades, enveloping him. If he moved even a little, he would die. He did not expect that the young human emperor's sword will would be so terrifying. It was almost flawless, and it could erupt with the most fatal killing intent in an instant. Danger! Outside the battle circle, Yin Feng Wuo felt that something was wrong, and his expression suddenly changed. But the next moment, he found that he was also locked on by a sword will. Human Emperor Mu Jioga. Yin Feng Wuo's pupils suddenly shrank, and his face turned as pale as a sheet. There was no doubt that if he intervened in the battle between Nie Tian and Lin Fan, Mu Jioga would not stand idly by. In fact, with his status and identity, if he forcibly intervened, it would indeed be unfair. But Lin Fan was too terrifying, and Nie Tian was no match for him at all. It was a moment of life and death. Nie Tian's body suddenly shook, and then the sword will in his body suddenly erupted. Suddenly, the sound of demons and gods surged, and the sword will rushed in all directions, as if to break the cage of this part of the world. Bang, bang, bang! In the next moment, the sound of the sword will colliding could be heard. It was as if metal and stone were resonating. The devastating impact spread wildly, and the sword will collapsed one after another. Nie Tian suffered the strongest impact where the sword will exploded. Even though his martial body was strong, at this moment, he was covered in wounds. On the other hand, Lin Fan was only pushed back slightly, and he was not injured. In the blink of an eye, the sword will dissipated, but the sound of the sword echoed for a long time before completely disappearing. Nie Tian. Yin Feng Wuo saw Nie Tian standing there dripping with blood and immediately shouted. "I'm fine," Nie Tian responded. He was full of energy, and his injury was not too serious. Lin Fan, who was not far away, had a smile on his face. His eyes were filled with excitement as he looked at his prey. "Brother Nie, I offended you just now." Lin Fan smiled faintly and bowed slightly to Nie Tian, very courteously. Nie Tian's face was cold and solemn, and he did not speak. Not only had the other party offended him, the third sword had clearly wanted to kill him, but he had blocked it. Indeed, even though the human emperor had instructed him not to hurt Nie Tian, Lin Fan's third sword was indeed meant to take Nie Tian's life. However, he didn't expect Nie Tian to be able to block it. In this world, Nie Tian was the first swordsman of the same level to be able to block his third sword. The third sword was called the Heaven-Defying Sword. Apart from the terrifying sword intent, the most terrifying thing about it was that it was extremely difficult to break. Not to mention swordsmen of the same level, even those who were a realm higher than Lin Fan would rarely be able to break through his Heaven-Defying Sword. That was because the Heaven-Defying Sword was Wan Jian's killing move. There was no way to avoid it. If the sword intent was weak, the Heaven-Defying Sword would be almost unbreakable. However, Nie Tian was very smart and used an extraordinary method to break the Heaven-Defying Sword. Sword Intent Resonance. In an instant, Nye Tian burned his chi and blood, and with the help of the power of the gods and demons, he raised his sword intent to almost the same level as Lin Fan's sword intent. Then, he triggered the sword intent resonance and used the power of resonance to break the heaven-defying sword. This move was not only extremely dangerous, but also not something that ordinary people could do. To be able to trigger the sword intent resonance, it undoubtedly meant that Nye Tian had superhuman sword sense, and he had already sensed the vibration frequency of Lin Fan's sword intent. Only in this way could he trigger the sword intent resonance. Although this kid's talent in swordsmanship is not top-notch, his sword sense is superhuman, and his battle talent is unprecedented. Seeing that Nye Tian was fine, Yin Fenghua calmed down, and he was shocked. How could he not see what had happened in that instant? It was a miracle that Nye Tian could break Lin Fan's third sword. One should know that it was a moment of life and death, but Nye Tian could think of such a shocking way to break it. This was unparalleled battle talent. The strength of a martial artist not only depended on the talent and strength of the martial body itself, but also on the battle talent. Especially in a battle of life and death, people with super battle talent could often turn the situation around. If it was not Lin Fan who was fighting with Nye Tian, but a martial artist with ordinary strength who could crush Nye Tian, he would have been a corpse. Lin Fan's reaction was extremely fast when the sword intent resonance erupted, and he blocked most of the impact with his sword shield in time, so he was not injured. But Yin Fenghua could see that the impact Lin Fan suffered was not much less than Nye Tian, and the sword intent in his body was faintly unstable. Therefore, Nye Tian suffered external injuries, and Lin Fan suffered internal injuries. After all, Nye Tian's martial body was not comparable to Lin Fan's. Nye Tian could take the same impact head-on, but Lin Fan would be instantly killed. Nye Tian, your performance just now did not disgrace the name of the Star Saint Lord. If Donghuang Jingrong knew this in the underworld, he would be pleased. At this moment, Ren Huang opened his mouth and laughed. Senior Ren Huang, are you familiar with Senior Donghuang? Nye Tian took a deep breath, and his complexion became better. The wounds on his body gradually disappeared, and he looked at Ren Huang and asked. The human emperor smiled and said, You should be asking if I killed Donghuang Jingrong or not, right? Nye Tian's eyes froze, and he looked at Ren Huang cold, and did not say anything. I did not kill Donghuang Jingrong, but the order to kill him was given by me. Ren Huang laughed again and said clearly, If you want to take revenge, I will be waiting for you. His smile was very calm, as if he was talking about something unimportant. It seemed that in Ren Huang's eyes, Donghuang Jingrong was no different from an ordinary person. Thank you, Ren Huang, for telling me the truth. Nye Tian was also calm, and he nodded slightly. Ren Huang was a smart man, and he knew that even if he did not say anything, Nye Tian would definitely find out the truth. If that was the case, he might as well be honest. Brother Yin Feng, your 7-wounding sword formation did not lose in vain. Ren Huang smiled and looked at Yin Fenghua. Oh! Yin Fenghua's lips twitched, and he said, Brother Mu, you know about the 7-wounding sword formation too? I wanted to bring Fan Air to try it, but Nye Tian beat me to it. Ren Huang looked at Lin Fan, and he felt that it was a pity. With a calm smile, Yin Fenghua said in a clear voice, Then I have to thank Nye Tian. Otherwise, I would have become your nephew. He had just witnessed Lin Fan's strength, and if they were at the same realm, he would not be Lin Fan's opponent. Luckily, Nye Tian took the first step, or else Lin Fan would have become his sworn brother, and he would be 1 generation younger than Ren Huang. No wonder Ren Huang and Lin Fan came to the Yellow Springs sacred ground so quickly, and they were already in the 1,000 Layers Ghost domain. 10 Destruction Female Empress had just appeared in the 1,000 Layers Ghost domain, and Ren Huang arrived right after her. It was obviously not a coincidence. Ren Huang came to the 1,000 Layers Ghost domain personally, and it was obvious that he was here for Female Empress. Ren Huang personally came to the Thousand Layers ghost domain, and this also proved how terrifying 10 Destruction female empress was. One should know that Donghuang Jingrong did not even need Ren Huang's help. Chapter 4284. Evil Woman. The human emperor's eyes darkened. The killing intent in his eyes seemed to have solidified, enveloping the heavens and earth. It was formless and caused everyone to feel a suffocating pressure. He came to the Thousand Layers ghost domain to kill the evil woman. He was well aware of the dangers of the Thousand-Layer ghost forest. Ultimately, he needed the 4 great evil lords of the ghost clan, who were not weaker than the elders of the Ren Huang palace. Hence, he had come personally. To his surprise, he sensed the aura of the underworld Sword Sea as soon as he arrived at Ghost's domain. Of course, he knew that there were only a few people in this world who had the ability to open the underworld Sword Sea, and Yin Feng Wua happened to be one of them. He had guessed that Yin Feng Wua had opened the underworld Sword Sea to lure him here, so he had come. The 10 Annihilation Evil Woman is the great empress in the ghost race's prophecy. Even the human sovereign palace cannot back down, said Yin Feng Wua with a cold expression. Yin Feng Wua, how confident do you think the ghost clan can fight against the human emperor palace with their current strength? The human emperor's lips twitched as sword essence surged like a silver snake lurking in the void. Although the ghost race is no longer as glorious as it once was, there are still many experts in the 4 ghost lineages. There are at least 3 experts who are as powerful as me. Together with Gui Zhu and the Ghost Lord, as well as the elders of the 4 ghost bloodlines, if your human emperor palace wants to defeat the ghost race, you must pay the price. Yin Feng Wua was calm and composed, not afraid at all. Brother Yin Feng, are you talking about the 4 great evil lords of the ghost race? Ren Huang merely smiled and the corner of his lips curled up in disdain. But in my eyes, aside from Brother Yin Feng, the other 3 are not worth mentioning. As for the others you mentioned, in front of the human emperor's palace, they're even more useless. Yin Feng Wua's face instantly became gloomier. He didn't expect that human sovereign had such a thorough understanding of the ghost clan. The Hall of Human Emperors was mysterious and powerful. They had secretly ruled over the saints' world for tens of millions of years. Every single person in the Hall of Human Emperors was a peak expert. Aside from the 4 evil exalts, no one else among the ghosts posed any threat to the Hall of Human Emperors. In fact, even among the 4 evil lords, only Yin Feng Wua was considered a true powerhouse. The other 3 were much weaker. Human Emperor Mu, there is a power that you can't imagine in the Thousand Layers ghost realm. Although the ghost race is weak, they are not completely defenseless. Yin Feng Wua calmed down and said heavily, the ghost race is not the only enemy of the human emperor palace. I hope that the human emperor's palace won't waste too much energy on one person. Brother Yin Feng, since you asked me to come here, I'm sure you already have a plan in mind. You won't say it out loud, right? The human emperor smiled faintly and said directly. Human Emperor Mu, you and I represent the human emperor palace and the ghost race respectively. Why don't we make a bet? Yin Feng Wua said after a moment of silence. Let's hear it. The human emperor laughed. He was interested. I'll bet on the 2 of them. Yin Feng Wua glanced at Nye Tian and Lin Fan and said, the Yellow Spring holy ground has opened, and the Yellow Spring flower will bloom again very soon. We'll bet on who between Nye Tian and Lin Fan can walk to the end with the evil woman as the wager. As he spoke, his eyes darkened, and he looked at Nye Tian meaningfully. He continued, if Nye Tian wins, the human emperor's palace will let the evil woman go. If Lin Fan wins, what will the ghost race do? Before Yin Feng Wua could finish, the human emperor asked directly. If Lin Fan wins, the ghost race will hand over the evil woman, Yin Feng Wua said word by word after a long silence. All right. We'll swear on our sword hearts that we won't go back on our words. The human emperor's eyes trembled slightly, and he responded with a clear voice. Then, he waved his hand, and a sword heart-cursed stone appeared in the air. Following that, a stream of blood spurted out from his fingertip. His sword will instantly erupted and turned into a sword seal, which was engraved on the sword heart-cursed stone. Seeing this, Yin Feng Wua did the same and left a bloodline sword seal on the stone. Both of them were the top swordsmen in the world, so they naturally understood what it meant to swear on their sword hearts. Once a sword heart oath was violated, a sword heart evil seed would grow in one's heart. If it was light, one would go berserk, and if it was heavy, one would lose their life. This time, they were cutting off all paths of retreat and risking their lives. Nie Tian was shocked by the scene before him. His expression was dull, and he couldn't react for a long time. He didn't expect Yin Feng Wua to bring him here to protect Rui Qianyu in such a way. But could he really win against Lin Fan? In the battle just now, he was utterly defeated. He lost 3 times in 3 strikes and almost lost his life. Where did Yin Feng Wua get the courage to make such a decision? Meanwhile, on the other side, Lin Fan had a smile on his face. His eyes were like those of a hungry wolf, filled with the desire to hunt. Even though he had won the previous 3 sword strikes, the fact that Nie Tian had countered his 3rd sword strike was beyond his expectations. He really wanted to fight with Nie Tian again. This was the first time he had such high hopes for a swordsman of the same level. Therefore, the upcoming battle of the Yellow Springs made him excited. Whoosh! At this moment, Ren Huang raised his arm and a ray of sword chi shot out, cutting the sword heart-cursed stone in half and perfectly cutting the 2 bloodline sword seals. Brother Yin Feng, we will each take half of the sword heart-cursed stone. Ren Huang held 1/2 of the stone and gave the other half to Yin Feng Wua. Yin Feng Wua took the sword heart-cursed stone. The bloodline sword seals on it were left by Ren Huang. Both of them took each other's bloodline sword seals. Obviously, there was no room for negotiation. Brother Yin Feng, I still have something to do. I will take my leave first. See you in half a month. Ren Huang kept the sword heart-cursed stone and left. Nie Tian, I look forward to seeing you become stronger. Only then will the battle be interesting. Lin Fan looked at Nie Tian and smiled before flying towards the direction where Ren Huang disappeared. Yin Feng Wua and Nie Tian stared at the direction where the 2 disappeared in silence. They each had their own thoughts and didn't say a word. Nie Tian, do you hate me? After a while, Yin Feng Wua finally asked in a deep voice. You saw my battle with the young human emperor earlier. Aren't you afraid that I will lose? Nie Tian frowned. His tone was calm and emotionless. Yin Feng Wua smiled bitterly and sighed. I have no other choice. I have to do this. The human emperor's hall was too powerful. Even if the ghost race used all their power, they still wouldn't be able to resist. Nie Tian, this bet was the only chance for the evil woman and the ghost race. Fortunately, Nie Tian had been crushed in the previous battle. Otherwise, the human emperor might not have accepted this bet. Chapter 4285. You, Nie Tian, are even more of a sore loser. His words were like a sudden clap of thunder that shook Nie Tian's heart and soul for some reason. Yin Feng Wua had already seen through everything. He wasn't betting on Nie Tian's strength, but that Nie Tian was more of a sore loser than the Gui clan. Because he couldn't afford to lose, he couldn't lose. Nie Tian became cold. He stared at Yin Feng Wua for a long time without saying anything. Yin Feng Wua's move was dangerous and ruthless. He hovered a sharp sword above Nie Tian's head, forcing the latter to win. Nie Tian, I believe that anyone who can break through the sword formation of 7 injuries is no ordinary person. You! Yin Feng Wua seemed to have guessed what Nie Tian was thinking, and he spoke in a deep voice. However, before he could finish speaking, he was interrupted by Nie Tian. I won't lose, Nie Tianling said coldly. His voice was filled with unparalleled determination. Since he was forced into a dead end, he would face it head-on and press forward. Yin Feng Wua nodded slightly and said no more. He knew that this was unfair to Nye Tian, but he had no other choice. In the following days, Nye Tian cultivated non-stop, hoping to make a breakthrough in his strength before the Battle of the Yellow Springs began. Unfortunately, the more eager he was to break through, the more chaotic his sword heart became, and the more he couldn't improve. Yin Fenghua could see that Nye Tian was uncertain. He wanted to remind him many times, but he held back in the end. He knew that there were some things that Nye Tian had to figure out himself. Others' advice was useless and might even have the opposite effect. At the same time, some swordsmen began to enter the Yellow Springs sacred land. It was the first time these swordsmen had come to the Yellow Springs sacred land, so they were completely unfamiliar with the place. Of course, there were a few who had been here before, but had left because they didn't have the right to comprehend the sword in the Yellow Springs. Yin Fenghua discovered that a large portion of the swordsmen who entered this time were young swordsmen. There were even some who were about the same age as Nye Tian. It seemed that many sword geniuses had appeared in the sacred world in recent years. Suddenly, Yin Fenghua realized that there were many people gathered not far away. Something seemed to have happened. Let's go and take a look. Yin Fenghua saw that Nye Tian was cultivating, so he decided to go and take a look himself. In midair, thousands of people gathered together, and in the center of them, two figures stood coldly, their auras clashing. Damned girl, you want to fight me? You're simply courting death. The black-robed swordsman's sword intent surged around him, like a black cloud, incomparably gloomy, giving off an extremely oppressive feeling. And opposite him, a devastatingly beautiful figure in snow-white clothes, as cold as ice. Like a mountain, although the sword intent around him was surging, it was not released and was extremely restrained. She was very calm, as if the black-robed swordsman in front of her did not exist. The surrounding swordsmen looked at the two of them and could not help but discuss. This black-robed swordsman's sword intent is very vigorous. He should be a famous swordsman. That guy is Yi Xiangshan of the Sun's Word Villa, one of the three Banes of the Sun's Word. I heard that he was a peak swordsman at the peak of sword consciousness defiant a long time ago. He's probably a swordsman of Saint Defire by now. I wonder how that girl offended him. She actually provoked him. That girl is still young. She'll probably be killed by Yi Xiangshan with a single strike. It's a pity that she's so beautiful, the crowd said as they looked at the white-robed woman with some pity. However, the white-robed woman was like an iceberg, unmoved by the outside world at all. It was as if everything that was happening had nothing to do with her. At this moment, Yin Fenghua's eyes suddenly lit up as he looked at the white-robed woman. Even though the white-robed woman had deliberately restrained her sword intent, it was completely exposed before a swordsman of Yin Fenghua's level. Yin Fenghua really did not expect the white-robed woman's sword intent to be so terrifying. In that instant, the scene of his battle with the white-robed woman appeared in his mind, and the outcome was actually uncertain. At his level, his sword intent was already extremely precise. This undoubtedly meant that the white-robed woman's sword intent was not inferior to his. It was just too terrifying. Yin Fenghua was a swordsman who had become one with the sword. His sword intent had reached the peak, and it was something rarely seen in the world. Even Nye Tian, who had broken the 7 wounding sword formation, could not compare to him in terms of sword intent. However, the white-robed woman was not any weaker than him. There was no way he would not be shocked. He could not even believe that there was such a terrifying swordswoman in the world. Due to the difference between male and female martial bodies, it was much more difficult for a female swordsman to reach the peak of sword intent compared to a male swordsman. From this, it could be seen that the white-robed woman's talent in the sword Dao was even greater than Yin Fenghua's. If Yin Fenghua had met the woman earlier, he might have chosen her to fight against Lin Fan instead of Nye Tian. However, the white-robed woman was very young. Her sword Dao was only in the 9th level of sword Heavenly Calamity, while her opponent, Yi Xiangshan, was a swordsman in the first level of Saint Defire. There was practically no chance for a swordsman in the 9th level of Sword Heavenly Calamity to win against a swordsman in the first level of Saint Defire. The difference in sword Dao became even more obvious the further one went. It was true that the white-robed woman was a monstrous swordsman, but Yi Xiangshan was clearly not a mediocre swordsman. The difference between them was an entire level, and it was like the difference between heaven and earth. Yin Fengwu knew that even if he suppressed his realm to the 9th level of Sword Heavenly Calamity and did not use the advantage of his martial body, it would still be very difficult for him to defeat Yi Xiangshan. When he thought of this, he could not help but feel a little nervous. He was already prepared to attack. He would not allow such an outstanding swordsman to fall in front of him like this. Die, you damned girl! In the air, Yi Xiangshan let out a low bellow, after which, his silhouette directly moved, and a black heavy sword appeared in his hands. As he slashed out, his sword intent burst forth, and a sword shadow the size of a mountain suddenly pressed down, enveloping the white-robed woman. It enveloped her. Everyone's eyes trembled. Their nerves instantly tensed up, as if they could already see a devastating scene. However, the white-robed woman stood where she was. She did not move, and there was not even the slightest change in her expression. When the sword shadow was only 100 meters away from her, she finally moved. Swoosh! In an instant, a sword will that was as red as blood suddenly exploded. Instantly, a terrifying sharp aura spread out, and the heavens and the earth fell into a chilling atmosphere. In the next instant, an extremely shocking scene happened. In mid-air, the mountain-like sword shadow was directly split into 2 halves by a ray of red light, shattering into pieces. Yi Xiangshan's eyes trembled. Before he could react, a ray of red light flew in front of him. The distance between his eyes widened infinitely, and his whole body was actually split in half. The shocking and bloody scene shocked everyone present. Everyone's eyes trembled violently, and they were immediately petrified. The whole world seemed to be frozen. The white-robed woman was expressionless, but the sharpness in her eyes caused people to tremble. In the distance, Nie Tian looked at the figure that was like an ice mountain and said in a daze, Shui. Chapter 4286. Cold Phoenix Ji Shui. Nie Tian's eyes trembled slightly. He stared at the cold figure in the air in disbelief. It was as if he was in a dream, and he was stunned for a long time. He never thought that he would run into Cold Phoenix Ji Shui here. Cold Phoenix Ji Shui stood coldly in the air. The aloofness in her eyes was like ice that would not melt for 10,000 years. There was a bone-chilling coldness in her eyes. After a long while, the crowd reacted to the situation, and gasps of shock could be heard. Just who is this woman? How can she be so strong? Yi Xiangshan is one of the 3 evils of the heavy sword, a swordsman at the level of Saint Defire. This woman killed him with 1 slash. Isn't she a swordsman at the peak of Saint Defire? This is the first time I've seen such a young swordsman at the peak of Saint Defire, and she's a woman. How terrifying! As the crowd spoke, the way they looked at Cold Phoenix Ji Shui changed completely. There was fear in their eyes that could not be hidden. In the distance, Yin Fengwu's eyes glazed over for a few seconds. Only then did he react. The shock in his heart was like a stormy sea, causing him to almost jump up in shock. He had been prepared to attack, but he did not expect Cold Phoenix Ji Shui to be so terrifying. She killed Yi Xiangshan with 1 slash. At that moment, he was certain that if he fought with Cold Phoenix Ji Shui in terms of sword will, he would definitely lose. He could not imagine that there was such a terrifying swordsman in the world. He had always thought that his talent in the way of the sword had reached its limit, but at that moment, in front of Cold Phoenix Ji Shui, he felt that he was very mediocre. In the air, Cold Phoenix Ji Shui suddenly noticed something. Her eyes darkened, and she fixed her gaze on Nie Tian in the distance. A burning light appeared in her eyes, but it disappeared in a flash. Then, without saying anything, she turned around and was prepared to leave. Stupid girl, you killed someone from Heavy Sword Villa, and you want to leave just like that? But at that moment, a deep voice rose, and a powerful sword glare appeared. It sliced through the air, and went to attack Cold Phoenix Ji Shui. Danger! The crowd was so shocked by the scene in front of them that their eyes trembled, and they instinctively cried out. Cold Phoenix Ji Shui frowned slightly. A crimson sword appeared in her hand, and countless flame-like sword shadows surged out. They instantly formed a sword shield that blocked the fatal sword glare. However, she still suffered from the terrifying impact. Her figure could not help but fall back a few meters. She swayed a few times before she stabilized herself. Although she tried her best to hold on, there was still a trace of blood at the corner of her mouth. Seeing this, Yin Feng Wuo could not help but frown. He was puzzled. Although the previous sword ray was powerful, it was not much stronger than Yi Xiangshan's attack. The Cold Phoenix Ji Shui was able to kill Yi Xiangshan with a single strike, so there was no reason for her to be injured by this sword light. She has an old injury. In the next moment, Yin Feng Wuo suddenly noticed it. His pupils shrank, and he cried out in shock. He suddenly felt that there was a violent sword force attacking Ling Huang Ji Shui's body, which was why she was injured. This berserk sword energy was clearly not caused by the sword attack just now. Rather, it had already existed in Ling Huang Ji Shui's body. In other words, the Cold Phoenix Ji Shui had killed Yi Xiangshan with a single slash even though she herself was injured. If she wasn't injured, it was hard to imagine how terrifying she would be. Shan Ashui. At this moment, someone recognized the person who had just attacked and couldn't help but cry out. Damned girl, you killed my third brother. Don't even think about leaving here alive today. High up in the sky, a burly man in black robes had a dark expression. He stared at Ling Huang Jishui and roared in a low voice. Seeing this, the crowd immediately exploded. Shan Ashui is the second of the heavy sword Three Evils, and Yi Xiangshan is his sworn brother. This is bad. Two of the heavy sword Three Evils have appeared at the same time. Could it be that the legendary sword butcher Ling Qinxiang is also here? The heavy sword Three Evils rarely split up. Ling Qinxiang is probably here too. As the crowd discussed, they looked around, trying to find the leader of the heavy sword Three Evils. The heavy sword Three Evils were from the Heavy Sword Villa. Although the Heavy Sword Villa was not a peak force in the All-Heaven Sacred World, it was still quite powerful. Especially in the Sword World, the Heavy Sword Villa was famous for its fierceness. They often plundered and annexed other sword sections. According to the legends, the master of the Heavy Sword Villa was a swordsman at the peak of St. Defire. He had an extremely terrifying background. Because of this, ordinary great forces did not dare to provoke the Heavy Sword Villa. The Heavy Sword Three Evils were the experts of the Heavy Sword Villa. They had made great contributions to the expansion of the Heavy Sword Villa. Especially the leader of the three, Ling Qinxiang. She had once destroyed 13 sword sects and massacred their sections. Her methods were extremely cruel, and she was called the Sword Butcher in the Sword World. At this moment, the crowd could not help but worry that Ling Qinxiang was also here. If that was the case, Ling Huang Jishui was dead for sure. The crowd was shocked by Ling Huang Jishui's talent. If she died just like that, it would be quite a pity. Make your move. Ling Huang Jishui raised her head slightly and looked at Shan Ashui in the sky. She was like a sword of ice and snow, emotionless. You're looking to die. Shan Ashui was infuriated. He roared and slashed with his sword. Immediately, the sword turned into a torrential wave. The wave swallowed everything and pressed towards Ling Huang Jishui fiercely. Ling Huang Jishui's sword pierced through the air. Wherever the tip of the sword pointed, the sword will burst forth. The crimson sword shadow whizzed out like a dragon. Bang! In the next moment, the two extreme powers collided. The crimson sword shadow tore a hole in the endless wave, but it was still drowned by the torrential sword will. Leng Huang Jishue's figure moved, but she was forced to retreat 1,000 meters. Before she could stabilize herself, she spat out a mouthful of blood. Although she was extremely talented, her cultivation level was too low. In addition to her old injuries, it was impossible for her to fight against Shan Ashui head-on. Die! Shan Ashui roared again. Instantly, an even more terrifying sword attack erupted and went straight for Leng Huang Jishue. Rumble! The surging sword will set off monstrous waves in the sky. Its majestic power seemed to want to swallow everything. Leng Huang Jishue's eyes were gloomy. The sword will around her was surging, but the sword power in her body was like a wild beast. It seemed to want to tear her body apart, and she could not use any power at all. Share! In the distance, Nie Tian's pupils shrank. He rushed over, but it was already too late. At the critical moment, just as the majestic sword will was about to drown Leng Huang Jishue, a strange scene happened. A boundless sword will swept across the sky. Its aura was not very strong, but it was like the spring wind and rain. It instantly dissipated Shan Ashui's sword will into nothingness. This! Everyone's eyes trembled. They were stunned by the strange scene. Chapter 4287. Shan Ishue's sword was broken, and an old man as fat as a ball appeared in front of him. He could not help but be shocked, and his expression changed drastically. Although the figure of the old man before him was a little exaggerated, the sword intent that surged around him was extremely terrifying. He was like a lion that was accumulating strength and waiting to strike. Once he struck, he would be able to tear everything apart. Shan Ishue was the second of the 3 heavy sword criminals. Even though he was not a peak swordsman, his perception toward sword will was still very strong. At that moment, he sensed one word from the old man's sword will: pressure. This pressure made him, a swordsman at the level of Saint Defire, feel like he could not breathe. With his realm and power, even a swordsman at the peak of Saint Defire would not be able to give him such great pressure. Just who is this old man? Nie Tian looked at the old man, and his tense heart instantly relaxed, because the old man was Yin Feng Wua. Yin Feng Wua could be said to be at the peak of the sword world. Since he had attacked, Rui Qianyu would naturally be fine. The crowd looked at Yin Feng Wua, and their expressions changed. They were all extremely talented swordsmen. Even though Yin Feng Wua had intentionally restrained his sword will, they could still sense how terrifying he was. The 3 heavy sword criminals, right? Yin Feng Wua lifted his head slightly and looked at Shan Ishue. He said with a smile, "No matter what, you are a great swordsman and a senior of the sword world. It seems a little inappropriate for you to attack a little girl in front of so many people. Old mister, this woman killed my 3rd brother. As her 2nd brother, it is only natural that I take revenge. This is a private matter between me and the witch. Please be magnanimous and do not meddle in this." Shan Ishue's expression was restrained, and his tone was respectful. He was not an idiot. Of course he knew that Yin Feng Wua was not someone to be trifled with. "I'm sorry, I have no other interests, but I like to meddle in other people's business." Yin Feng Wua chuckled and said, "In my opinion, this matter should end here." "Senior, what do you mean?" Shan Ishue frowned. It was clear that he was suppressing his anger. The 3 heavy sword criminals were reputable people. How could he let them die in vain? "I can tell that your 3rd brother is not a good person at first glance. This little girl killed him. He deserves it. If you don't want to die, leave here quickly." Yin Feng Wua didn't want to waste any more time, so he said coldly. When Shan Ishue heard that Yin Feng Wua wanted to chase him away, his face darkened. He said, "Senior, this is not your place. What right do you have to chase me away?" "I'm sorry, this really is my place." Yin Feng Wua smiled again and took a step forward. In the blink of an eye, before Shan Ashui could react, a streak of blood splashed in front of his eyes, and one of his arms was severed. He was as he could as he wanted. He could he wanted. Big brother! Shan Ashui suddenly turned around and saw a familiar face behind him. He could not help but feel happy. Lung Qinxiang. Lung Qinxiang's sudden appearance made everyone's gazes tremble. Many people simultaneously cried out in alarm. Lung Qinxiang's face was solemn. He stared at Yin Fengwu with sharp eyes. He was not afraid at all. What a strong murderous aura! Nie Tian looked at Lung Qinxiang. He could feel the murderous aura around Lung Qinxiang. He could not help but shudder. He had seen many powerful swordsmen, but he had never seen someone with such a strong murderous aura. Lung Qinxiang was just standing there, but the murderous aura around him gave people a suffocating feeling of deterrence. Sword killer, the butcher of swords. Lung Qinxiang's hands were stained with countless lives. His murderous aura was nourished by these lives. This strong murderous aura made him much stronger than other swordsmen of the same level. Here comes a big one. Yin Fengwu looked at Lung Qinxiang and smiled. But his eyes were strange. He seemed to have discovered something. Old thing, mind your own business, Lung Qinxiang said in a deep voice. His eyes were filled with murderous intent. Even facing Yin Fengwu, he was not afraid at all. What if this deity wants to interfere? Yin Fengwu smiled again. His expression became even more strange. Die. Lung Qinxiang was silent for a few seconds. Then he moved. Like an arrow leaving the bow, he condensed a strong murderous aura and suddenly shot out to attack Yin Fengwu. He was very smart. He knew that he was not Yin Fengwu's opponent. So he attacked in an instant. He wanted to catch the latter unprepared. In the blink of an eye, a terrifying murderous aura spread out. Everyone felt as though an invisible hand was strangling their necks at this moment. This was the terrifying part of Lung Qinxiang. The instantaneous burst of sword intent and murderous aura combined perfectly. It formed an extremely strong suppressive force. Even some people stronger than him could be instantly killed. But unfortunately, Yin Fengwu was too strong. He was far from his match. Just as Lung Qinxiang was about to approach Yin Fengwu, he suddenly felt an invisible pressure coming from the void. It made his figure stagnate. He could not move an inch forward. Then, an even more terrifying force appeared. It instantly imprisoned him and pressed down on him. It was as if it wanted to squeeze him to death. How? Lung Qinxiang said with difficulty. He resisted with all his might. But the force was getting stronger and stronger. It was not something he could fight against. He did not expect Yin Fengwu to be so terrifying. He could crush him with the pure power of sword intent. Everyone was shocked by the scene in front of them. They all sucked in a breath of cold air, speechless. Lung Qinxiang was a swordsman who was close to the peak of sword martial Saint Defire. But he could not fight back in front of Yin Fengwu. How strong was the latter? But Yin Fengwu did not kill Lung Qinxiang. Instead, he controlled his sword intent in an extremely subtle way. He made the latter beg for death. Old thing, kill me if you have the guts. Lung Qinxiang was extremely fierce. He forced himself to roar. The blood in his body surged. It caused several bloody wounds to appear on his body. Nie Tian frowned. He did not know what Yin Fengwu was doing. The latter was not the kind of person who took pleasure in torturing people. Your sword intent, who taught you? Yin Fengwu's face darkened. He asked in a deep voice. Sword intent? Nie Tian was stunned. He suddenly realized that Lung Qinxiang's sword intent was similar to Yin Fengwu's 7 wounds sword intent. Could it be that Lung Qinxiang and Yin Fengwu had some relationship? Bah! Lung Qinxiang's face was twisted. He refused to speak. Chapter 4288. A murderous figure appeared in the sky. He was like a bolt of lightning that tore through space and shook the world. Yin Fengwu's eyes trembled violently when he heard this voice. He suddenly raised his head and locked his eyes on the murderous figure. His gloomy face immediately changed. He was shocked and even slightly terrified. Nie Tian's heart clenched when he saw Yin Feng Wu's reaction. He looked at the figure in the sky. The person who came was tall and sturdy. He stood there with his back straight like a sharp sword, releasing a terrifying aura. He was hidden under a black robe, so no one could see his face clearly. However, the sword while surging around him was extremely terrifying. His eyes shone with eerily cold light as he locked onto Yin Feng Wu. "You're not dead." Yin Feng Wu's eyes trembled as he spoke in a low voice, as if he had seen a ghost. Nie Tian could not help but feel puzzled. With Yin Feng Wu's strength and composure, just who could make him so nervous? "Teacher, you haven't returned to heaven yet. How can your disciple be one step ahead of you?" the newcomer said coldly. His voice was hoarse and low, and it was filled with great pressure. "Disciple?" Nie Tian's eyes trembled. He had not expected the newcomer to be Yin Feng Wu's disciple. However, if he was Yin Feng Wu's disciple, why was he so surprised? "That's impossible." Yin Feng Wu calmed down and said in a low voice, "I killed you back then. You can't be alive." Nie Tian frowned. He finally understood why Yin Feng Wu was acting so strangely. "Teacher, it's rare that you still remember that you killed me." The newcomer's eyes shone like a wolf in the night. He said, "It's a pity that I'm not fated to die. I've lived until now. Teacher, you must be very disappointed." His voice was extremely low and filled with eerily cold, killing intent. It was as if the person before him was not his teacher, but his greatest enemy. "You have reason to hate me for what happened back then, but I've never regretted it," Yin Feng Wu said in a low voice as he recalled many things. Tang Baiming was the newcomer's name. A very long time ago, Tang Baiming had been a genius with the sword with outstanding talent. Before he was 1,000 years old, he had reached Saint Defire realm of sword martial arts, shocking the sacred world. At that time, many people only knew that Tang Baiming was a peerless sword prodigy, but almost no one knew that he was being guided by a peak expert, Yin Feng Wu. For a long time, Yin Feng Wu and Tang Baiming were master and disciple in reality, but not in name. Because Yin Feng Wu had a rule of never accepting disciples, he only taught Tang Baiming, but did not accept him as a disciple. Tang Baiming was grateful to Yin Feng's selflessness and wanted to become his disciple. Then, one day, Yin Feng Wu unintentionally mentioned that Tang Baiming had given pointers to another person and had almost taken that person as his disciple. From that day onwards, Tang Baiming bore a grudge against Yin Feng Wu. He believed that Yin Feng Wu was unwilling to accept him as a disciple because of that person. Therefore, he began to use every possible means to inquire about that person. Finally, he found out that person's identity and found that person. After Tang Baiming found that person, a battle of life and death broke out between the two due to the long-standing resentment in his heart. In the end, Tang Baiming killed that person. In order to prevent this matter from spreading, he killed more than 1,000 people in that person's family. Unfortunately, Yin Feng Wu still refused to accept Tang Baiming as a disciple. In a fit of rage, Tang Baiming revealed the murder, which immediately angered Yin Feng Wu. In a fit of rage, Yin Feng Wu killed Tang Baiming with his own hands and buried him in a nameless valley in the Thousand Layers Ghost Domain. But what Yin Feng Wu never expected was that Tang Baiming was not dead. "Hate!" Tang Baiming looked at Yin Feng Wu and smiled strangely. He said, "My swordsmanship was imparted to me by Master. What reason do I have to hate Master? It's just that I don't understand. I treat Master like a teacher and a father, and I revere him like a god. Why did Master refuse to accept me as a disciple? Master and disciple are just a relationship. It's just a meaningless title. Is it really that important?" Yin Feng Wu frowned and said, "I'm glad that I didn't accept you back then. Because of jealousy, you killed him and even his family. You killed him along with his family. A homicidal maniac like you doesn't deserve to be my disciple. Tang Baiming's pupils shrank as he let out a maniacal laugh. In Feng Wua, you finally said that. You didn't accept me not because you don't value our relationship as master and disciple, but because you value it too much. Don't you feel that? You think that I, Tang Baiming, don't deserve to be your disciple. In Feng Wua frowned, his expression a little ugly. He didn't expect Tang Baiming to be so stubborn. Back then, he insisted on not accepting Tang Baiming as a disciple because he could see that Tang Baiming's stubbornness had become an inner demon. He originally thought that he could help Tang Baiming get rid of his inner demon, and then he would naturally accept Tang Baiming as a disciple. But he didn't expect that Tang Baiming's inner demon was too strong. Not only did his actions not get rid of it, but it also made Tang Baiming's inner demon grow stronger and stronger, until that incident happened. In Feng Wua had no choice but to kill Tang Baiming. He felt guilty about what happened to Tang Baiming. Back then, he taught Tang Baiming because he was a talented swordsman and hoped to groom a real opponent for himself. He didn't expect to groom a murderous maniac. Perhaps he had placed too much hope on Tang Baiming, which led to the latter's stubbornness, which eventually led to a disaster. In Feng Wua, it was you who created me. Therefore, half of the killing karma on my hands is yours. At this moment, Tang Baiming laughed coldly and shouted, "Do you know who I am now? Is that important?" In Feng Wua replied coldly, "Of course it is." Tang Baiming smiled again and said, "Because I am now the master of the Qinjian Villa." In Feng Wua frowned, a little confused. However, Tang Baiming's words shocked everyone. So he is the master of the Qinjian Villa. No wonder he is so strong. The mysterious master of the Qinjian Villa has finally shown up. All these years, the Qinjian Villa has been annexing other sword sections. Whether they surrendered or resisted, they were all killed. How cruel! With such a powerful master, no wonder the Qinjian Villa is so arrogant. The crowd started discussing, their eyes focused on Tang Baiming with anger and fear.